The town was called Needle Point because of the way the peninsula hooked back on itself, a stitch pulling sea into land and land into rumor. Ferries only came on Saturdays now, and even then they left before the church bells learned which hour to claim. On maps, the place looked like a comma. In person, it felt like a pause that had gone on too long. Juno rented the upstairs over a shuttered sail repair shop, whose windows still smelled of resin and phantom salt. At night the awning sang when the wind remembered the right lane through its torn canvas. From her bed she could see two things that didn't belong together: the lighthouse blinking every 9 seconds, and the old weather radar on Cemetery Hill that hadn't spun in years but insisted on humming, as if it were still decoding clouds. The first rawness came with the tide. It arrived full and never left. Water pooled in the harbor like a hell breath and refused to remember the moon. Boats sat at their ropes like thoughts that wouldn't finish. Crabs walked sideways across reflections, then went straight up a wall of stillness that should have been surface. The older men called it shelving, the way water sometimes stands on its manners before a storm. But storms didn't wait this long. They didn't curate the quiet. Juno heard the change before anyone else said it aloud. The hush had a frequency now, a soft effort you felt along the jaw, the kind that turned drinking glasses honest. If she breathed shallow, it vanished. If she filled her lungs and held a second past comfort, the tone returned and laid itself under her ribs like a promise that hadn't decided who to keep yet. She tried recording it. Her phone caught nothing but room tone and the click of her own throat. The little tape deck her father had left her, the one that still ate cassettes when jealous, did better. On tape, the silence developed a spine. You could rewind to the exact second the quiet thickened. You could fast forward and watch it thin, as if the town were hiding passages between. On the third day of the stalled tide, a boy named Micah kicked his soccer ball down the slope behind the post office and watched it roll into the harbor, where it floated without bobbing, as if it found a pane of glass beneath something you shouldn't walk on. He went after it and didn't sink. 2 steps, 3, 4, across the shine. Then the water remembered itself and took him without splash or drama, the way a beloved book closes in a breeze. They pulled him out blue an ordinary 10 seconds later from the exact same spot. He coughed up lake water, though the town had only ever owned sea. His hair smelled like thunder. When he looked at Juno, she was nearest. He didn't ask for his mother. He said, with a calm that made everyone else want to run, "The bottom hums." After that, the radios turned polite. Channel 3, which belonged to weather but mostly played old basketball games nobody won anymore, began clearing its throat at odd minutes. A single breath of static that shaped itself around the F, then stepped aside as if embarrassed to have been heard. Pastor Ellis took it as a warning. The dive shop called it marketing. The teenagers tried to sample it into a song and found the tone refused accompaniment. It only wanted listening. Needle Point adapted the way towns do, by pretending not to and then suddenly having. The diner put the soup of the day, chalkboard inside, because chalk made a scraping sound now like guilt. The ferry honked once at noon whether it was there or not. The lighthouse blinked 9s and the radar hummed, and someone's wind chimes tried to spell a word that tasted like coins and prayer. Juno kept notes. It was what she had left when the leaving refused to stop traveling through her. 7-Eleven, she wrote. The cat froze mid-jump, then finished softer than gravity. 10:03, tide shelf holds, gull feet don't puncture. 15:19, channel 3. Breath, then no, not breath, hearing. At dusk, she walked to the breakwater where the stones keep each other honest, and sat with her boots touching the new surface of the harbor. If she leaned, the water didn't take a reflection. It considered it. The lighthouse made its measure blink, and the radar on the hill hummed, and each time the beam passed, the F warmed, as if the air were shy about being seen. "What are you?" she asked the flat water, the radar, the light, her own mouth, the town. "What do you want?" The answer wasn't a voice. It was an edit. The world corrected her posture half an inch, the way a patient teacher nudges a wrist to keep a line true. She sat straighter without noticing. Shoulders unlearned their apology, and the tone deepened until it was less note and more room. Something out there had made space inside what she was. That night the fog came from inland, rolling over headstones in the rusted radar dish as if the land had started to dream the sea back to itself. It pulled in small courtesies, on porches, in cupped hands, in the hollow behind the ear where someone once whispered that they were staying and then couldn't. Juno stood at her window with the tape deck rewinding itself. She didn't touch it, and watched the lighthouse blink 9 and 9 again, and the fog blink back one slow yes. At 3:17 a.m., her kitchen clock rang once though it had never owned a bell. The sound was thin and perfect, and opened the walls like a window you forgot was there. Every radio in town inhaled at the same second, the way a stadium does before the throw that might make a religion out of a Sunday. The harbor breathed, and the shelf of water slouched, then held. Juno walked barefoot down the center of Cedar Street, because streets are truer at that hour, and nobody stopped her, because stopping belonged to daylight. At the stop sign by the cannery, the fog gathered itself into rectangles too tall to be doors and too generous to be walls. Not light, exactly, not absence, either. Edits. The air removed what wasn't needed, so you could see what had always been trying to be. The rectangles, 4, then 6, then a single vertical that made her stomach name a number she didn't know, hovered above the harbor. They didn't touch the still water. They made touching unnecessary. The radar on Cemetery Hill shivered and turned 1 degree for the first time in 13 years. Okay, Juno said to no one, to the rectangles, to the tape deck she brought without pockets, to the wind that hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to be here. Okay. The tone in her bones answered. Not louder, closer. She felt it assemble its grammar out of her heartbeat, and the lighthouse blink and the breath held by the divided sea. In that grammar, meaning wasn't something you added to sound. It was what remained when you stopped insisting on words. The fog shifted. A corridor opened from the breakwater to the base of the radar. She could see the footpath through grass and glass and a half of town that had chosen window rather than sleep. People leaned their heads out like nesting birds. No one filmed. Even the anxious kept their hands. A thing had arrived that didn't want to be owned. Micah, the boy who had walked the water and come back speaking lake, appeared at her elbow without the manners of footsteps. You hear it? He asked, not looking at her. His eyes reflected the rectangles like scriptures that never met paper. Yes, Juno said. It wants us to remember how to breathe, he said, as if reporting a rule, not a miracle. How? He smiled at child's terrible wisdom. Longer. The lighthouse blinked its 9, and the radar hummed, and the shelf of water leaned in a way that would have been tide if tide hadn't retired. The fog made of edits made of almost light tilted, and inside the tilt Juno saw something she knew she would spend the rest of her life learning how to look at. A wall not made of stone or code, but of balances. Thin, bright lines tallying kindness and cowardice, and the rest of it in strokes that forgave even as they counted. She looked for her father's name, and found instead the day he had chosen to wait, at a blinking red, rather than run it. The wall gave that minute a glow that outlived him. She looked for her own worst. The wall offered her a door instead, then waited to see if she remembered how to open it. The radar dish turned 1 more degree and settled into a posture that read as attention. The fog rectangles thinned to almost, then to not quite, then to gone. The shelf slouched, and the harbor remembered the moon enough to move 1 quiet inch. Juno exhaled. The town exhaled with her. The tape deck clicked stop, because sometimes even machines know how to bow. On Cedar Street, air learned how to hold silence without making it empty. Tomorrow, Micah said, as if there were agreements in the dark he'd signed on the town's behalf. Bring a radio. It listens better when it hears itself. Juno nodded, because nodding belongs to beginnings. Above Cemetery Hill, the radar dish faced a point in the sky that none of the apps could name, and decided that was fine. The lighthouse blinked 9. The harbor took another inch. The F in Juno's chest softened until it felt like mercy. She walked home with the tone, with the edits, with the shelf and the boy and the wall of balances that forgave the arithmetic even as it kept accounts. On her kitchen table, the clock had learned not to be certain. It held 3:17 for 1 more kindness, and then let the minute go. Outside, the harbor did the same. Morning never quite arrived in Needle Point after that night. It showed up, technically, The light came, the fog softened, color returned to roofs and windows, but it didn't land. It hovered instead, cautious and weightless, as though the air itself had grown too careful, balancing between day and a memory of something that didn't like being watched. The kind of mourning that exists only out of obligation. Juno woke to the sound of her own pulse playing through the tape deck she'd forgotten to unplug. The cassette had rewound itself during the night, looping a soft rhythm of plastic patience. When she pressed play, no music came, only the faint, steady thump of her heartbeat, and her own voice recorded somehow, without her having spoken. You said yes. Remember that. The words had no echo, no room tone, as though they'd been uttered in a vacuum. She almost laughed, because of course she hadn't said yes to anything, not in words. Yet when she tried to recall the exact moment the rectangles of light dissolved, there was a distinct ache of agreement behind her ribs, as if her body had nodded where her mind had not. The air in her room carried the faint smell of electricity cooled by salt. Everything seemed charged and still. The curtains unmoving, the clock's hands uncertain whether to tick. The cat was gone. Its paw print stopped halfway across the rug, where the morning light from the window pooled like unfinished glass. Outside, the world was awake but tentative. Down on Main Street, the diner's bell didn't ring when the door opened. The sound existed. She could see it in people's faces, but it no longer traveled. The town had begun to move in pantomime. Gesture still attached to meaning, but detached from sound. Even the gulls, those lifelong narcissists, circled in silence, their wings slicing fog without finding wind. Juno crossed the street with a kind of reverence. Every footstep she took left a faint glow instead of noise, a visual substitute for the missing percussion of life. It was beautiful and unbearable. She ordered coffee from Janine, who had once been incapable of whispering. Janine poured it without asking. The sound of the liquid filling the cup never came, but Juno could feel the warmth humming in her palm when she lifted it. They exchanged looks that used to require words, but now found a simpler grammar. You heard it too? Yes. And you're pretending not to? Also yes. Around them, the air seemed to be waiting for a word, a sound, a signal, but none came. The jukebox lights blinked idly, remembering a song it no longer knew how to play. A child outside dropped his toy truck, and the clatter never arrived. He looked down, confused, and began to cry, but the sobs were noiseless, just air moving through a throat that had forgotten the art of being heard. When Juno finished her coffee, she left $1 on the counter, though she doubted Janine would ever count it. Outside, the sky had lost its usual shape. The blue felt stretched thin, like something fragile between her and an intelligence watching through it. The fog that had once come from the ocean now rose from the ground itself, slow and deliberate, as though the ridge was breathing again. Everywhere she looked, the familiar world flickered between presence and absence. The stoplight changed color, but no cars moved. The flag outside the post office hung motionless, its fabric shimmering faintly, as if remembering what it meant to wave. Even her own breath came delayed, a second or two behind the thought of inhaling. At the edge of town, near the old water tower, she found the others, the ones who had also been awake that night. Micah was there, still clutching the radio he'd built from spare parts. Ruth from the library. Walter from the docks. All of them standing, not talking, but listening to something she could feel but not hear. The ridge, distant and pale in the morning haze, glowed faintly beneath the surface of its stones, like veins beneath translucent skin. The glow pulsed once, then stilled. And the silence, oh, the silence, had weight now, texture, volume. Micah looked at her, eyes wide with the calm of a man too tired to be afraid. "It's not gone," he mouthed. Juno nodded slowly. "No, it's waiting for us to answer." She felt the words rather than heard them, vibrating through her chest in that strange new language of air and thought. When she turned back toward town, the sun finally rose fully above the ridge, and the light touched everything, roofs, water, faces, with unbearable gentleness. It wasn't warmth exactly, but awareness. The light noticed her. Somewhere far below the ridge, the hum began again, low, soft, intimate. Not a sound, but the idea of one. And for the first time since the lights came, Juno felt the world listening back. That afternoon, Juno carried her tape deck down to the harbor. The walk felt longer than usual, as if the air itself had developed more gravity. Every step she took left a slight indentation in the damp wood of the boardwalk, and each indentation lingered half a second too long before easing back into place. She didn't know whether it was exhaustion or reverence keeping her quiet. She needed proof. Proof that what had happened that night wasn't just a collective hallucination of a lonely town mourning its own forgottenness, that the lights, the hum, the silence that had swallowed sound itself, that all had substance, weight, intention. She needed the kind of proof that doesn't fade in daylight. The tide had returned, yes, but it didn't move the way it used to. The water was restless in a strange, meditative way, like a hand running over the same wound again and again to confirm it was still there. Each ripple retraced itself, folding and unfolding like a sentence reconsidering its own meaning. It wasn't motion. It was memory rehearsing. She set the recorder on the dock and hit record. The cassette's wheels turned without the reassuring click or whir. Even the small mechanical noises had vanished. She could see the motion of the spools, but heard nothing, not even the faint scrape of tape. Then, slowly, something began to bleed through. It wasn't sound. Not really. More vibration made of light and suggestion, a murmur stitched together from hesitation and voltage. It trembled through her ribs, not her ears. Her first thought was wind, but there was no wind. Her second thought was heartbeat, but it didn't match her pulse. This was something older than either. Juno leaned in. The air between her and the machine shimmered faintly, like heat above asphalt. The tape caught something organized but not spoken. When she slowed the playback with a fingertip, she could feel the pattern emerge in the rhythm. Short, long, pause. Short, long, pause. The pattern repeated again and again until it began to sound. Feel familiar. It was the same rhythm as the lighthouse's blink. Her mouth went dry. Micah appeared then, barefoot, the cuffs of his jeans soaked, holding a battered radio too large for his arms. He looked half terrified, half serene, like a man balancing on the edge of revelation and collapse. "Channel 3's breathing weird," he said, like it knows we're recording it. Juno blinked. "Breathing?" He nodded, setting the radio down beside her. The antenna crackled once, then steadied. They tuned it together, their hands brushing. The static between stations wasn't static anymore. It pulsed. The sound bent with each heartbeat, ebbing and swelling like a tide of invisible current. The hum from the night before began to reassemble itself, as though it had been sleeping inside the frequency. Then, something extraordinary. The air itself started to shape around the rhythm. The wind, if it was wind, moved in time with the tape. The harbor water began to rise and fall in gentle sympathy. Even the ropes tied to the dock creaked in unison, like an orchestra of tension. "The world's keeping time," Micah whispered. The pulse strengthened until the harbor and the radio and the tape all synchronized. Every object, every particle of air, seemed to vibrate in perfect rhythm. Juno could feel it moving through her sternum, a note too low for sound, too wide for hearing. It wasn't communication, it was communion. She lifted her gaze toward the radar dome on Cemetery Hill, visible through the fog. The dish was turning, slow, deliberate, but not toward the sea as usual. It had rotated inland, toward them. Her throat tightened. "Why would it look there?" she whispered. Micah's voice was steady, resigned. "Maybe it's not looking," he said. "Maybe it's listening." The phrase hung in the fog like breath you could almost see. The fog thickened, though it was not cold anymore. It was warm, like the air after lightning, carrying a faint metallic taste. From its folds, faint geometric shapes began to shimmer, not above in the sky, but across the wet dock planks. They looked like reflections, but there was nothing above to reflect. The light came from within the wood itself, as if the dock remembered being touched by something vast. Micah took a step back. "Juno." The light on the planks expanded into 4 rectangles, pulsing faintly. Each glow aligned with the rhythm on the tape. It was as though the sound, or whatever had replaced sound, had learned to write itself in light. Then came the voice. From the radio, from the tape, from the water, from the air itself. Not electronic, not human, but familiar in a way grief is familiar. Too intimate to belong to anyone else. Juno, the syllables dragged slightly, like a record slowed by touch. Then again, softer. Juno breathed longer. Her lungs froze. The harbor itself seemed to tilt toward the sound, the water bending as though gravity had shifted its loyalties. Every seagull in the distance stopped mid-flight, wings outstretched in suspended motion. The voice didn't repeat. It didn't have to. Something in Juno's chest obeyed before she could think. She inhaled slowly, deeper than ever before, and when she did, the entire harbor inhaled with her. The air, the fog, the water, the wooden planks, all of it drew in, like the universe itself taking a breath through her lungs. She exhaled. The harbor followed. Micah stared, eyes wide, tears cutting silent paths down his cheeks. "It's not a message," he mouthed. "It's a lesson." Juno didn't respond. She couldn't. The air had gone thin again, shimmering, as though it was now made of something half-thought, half-memory. The fog deepened into gold, folding around them in slow undulation, and the dock, or maybe the world, leaned closer to listen. From somewhere deep beneath the water, the hum rose again, louder this time, alive and trembling, not mechanical but sentient. And when Juno closed her eyes, she saw, not with her sight, but with whatever part of her once dreamed, the rectangles suspended in the dark. Not lights now, but windows. And something behind them, vast and patient, breathing with her. That night, the entire town seemed to wait for someone else to exhale first. Even the neon signs at the diner dimmed between flickers, as though they were listening for their cue. The absence of sound was an emptiness. It was a held chord, the moment in a hymn when every throat remembers the note at once, and no one wants to be the first to break it. Doors opened a hand's width and stayed that way. Dogs stood with one paw lifted. The ocean wore the stillness of a lake dreaming of being mirrored. Juno walked the planks of the pier with the care of a librarian in a church, measuring each step against the hush. Beneath her, the pilings sweated salt, though it smelled of pine hearts and storms too old to name. She could feel the town gathered invisibly behind her, windows parting, curtains dimly glowing, people poised as if someone called roll in the dark and the next name might be theirs. The lighthouse offered slow blink, but the light felt gentler, like someone covering a sleeping child's face with shawl. She sat on the edge with the tape deck balanced on her knees, thumb hovering over the play button, as if pressing it would have legal consequences. The air carried the taste of copper and damp wood, a tang that made the tongue remember coins and thunderstorms. Channel 3, always more throat than station, had gone fully silent now. Not off, just withholding, the way a good teacher withholds an answer to see if the room can find its way to it alone. The red indicator light still glowed, steady as a pulse, as if to say, "I'm here. You're here. Don't rush to belonging." She pressed play. At first, the tape spun out the ordinary ghosts. Room noise, the friction of felt pads, a faint mechanical murmur too shy to be heard by anyone who hadn't spent half her life chasing noises other people called nothing. Then it arrived. Her voice, but not just hers, lifting out of Ferric with the softness of breath on glass. The vowel shaped itself around the air in her mouth without asking permission. But this time it wasn't alone. Other voices folded in beneath it, layered, harmonic, impossible. They came one by one, as if stepping up to some patient altar. The mechanic who'd lost his daughter to a bend in the river his maps never admitted. The teacher who'd stopped singing after the flood took the low wing of the school. The mailman whose voice had sealed itself shut the morning his brother didn't come back in with the tide. They weren't speaking words. Words would have ruined it. They were breathing together. In, pause, release. The cadence settled into them like a shared ancestral memory. Deeper than language, older than any liturgy the town had ever muttered over potlucks and funerals. The sound, if sound was even the right name now, swelled, and the harbor responded with a ripple that started nowhere and everywhere at once, spreading outward until even the fog shivered like silk struck by the idea of wind. Somewhere on Main Street, a window sash rasped open and stuck at an angle a carpenter would later return to with a grin, he wouldn't know how to explain. People leaned out, blinking like dreamers remembering their names over the mouth of a well. The cat returned with casual ceremony, stepping delicately over puddles that reflected no sky, only a tender brightness that belonged to the water itself. Micah's shoes announced nothing. He arrived as all necessary things do, at exactly the moment the space for them appeared. He stood beside her, holding his radio like an offering, not to the sky, but to the air that had finally admitted it was listening. "They're coming through," he said, but the words hovered between them without sound, as if sound no longer needed to sit on consonants to be true. "Who?" Juno shaped the question with her lips. The night answered as if it had been waiting for the syllables to exist. The ones who stayed quiet too long. He didn't point at graves or houses. He meant the pauses themselves, the unlived sentences, the mercy that had never been spoken aloud for fear of lowering the price of grief. Up on Cemetery Hill, the radar dish rotated another half-turn, its motor grinding softly, as if trying not to interrupt the music of restraint. The beam swept once across the harbor, passed over Juno, and paused with the gentlest insistence, like a teacher's hand on a shoulder, saying this part matters. Every light in needlepoint flickered once, off, on, brighter. The town didn't gasp, it consented. The fog condensed into 7 vertical shafts that hummed the exact pitch of the town's collective breath, each a column of almost light, like the shape steam might take if it learned posture. The shafts rose from the water, not like pillars, but like throats. For a moment, Juno had the ridiculous thought that the bay was practicing vowels. She closed her eyes and inhaled. The tone answered, surrounding her skull with warmth so intimate it felt like a childhood blanket pressed by a mother's hand. The warmth didn't push. It received. For the first time since the tide had stalled, the harbor moved of its own will, as though a muscle-long atrophied had finally rediscovered the memory of flexion. It rose, slowly, respectfully, until it touched her boots and whispered to them like apology, like we didn't mean to leave you with all the keeping. And then the voice, not from the radio, not from tape, but from the harbor itself, found the narrow bridge between her bones and her attention, and crossed it without asking for proof of identity. "You're part of the count now." The sentence did not travel from outside to in. It unfolded inside, and then rearranged the outside to match. The world waited to see if she'd breathe again. It was not suspense. It was choreography, the vast machine of tides and fog and memory asking for her, as a metronome. She did not move. The stillness had gravity. She thought of every breath she'd taken without thinking, of the way grief shrinks the lungs to the size of a fist, of the time she learned to hold her breath underwater, because it felt like rehearsal for a different drowning she couldn't name. She thought of her father humming tunelessly in a garage where radios want to be made honest, of Janine's laugh, held in a freeze of the day the river forgot its bargain with the shore, of the mailman pressing letters flat, so the words inside could travel without bruising. The count began anyway, whether she joined it or not. 1. Room of air. 2. Permission. 3. Softening. 4. Return. The numbers weren't numbers. They were the feel of numbers on the inside of the tongue. With each silent beat, the shafts brightened, the dock planks sighed, and the ropes tethering the boats loosened, as if reminded they were more suggestion than law. A child's window lit on Baird Street. Another joined it. Then a third, until the hillside looked like a constellation learning itself in real time. Ruth in the library appeared at the corner where Cedar meets Wharf, palm up, as if measuring rain. The mechanic, old hands black with softened grease, stood in his yard with his face turned to the harbor, lids lowered not in denial but in devotion. The teacher, whose throat had closed the afternoon the flood reorganized the school alphabet by loss, touched her own neck like a question and felt it answer. Part of the count. Micah mouthed again, not at Juno but at the night itself, and for the first time the night mouthed back, not with lips but with the edge of fog pulling into shape of acquiescence. Juno's lungs negotiated with her heart the way old friends do, wordlessly, with an economy of affection. She told them, and the town obeyed. She could feel it, the inhalation beyond her, 1,000 ribs expanding, the squeak of old window frames bowing, the tiny pop of bubbles and paint that outlived its maker, the stretch of flags, the bowing of trees, even a minute easing of the lighthouse's housing, as if the metal itself remembered it had once been or inside a patient hill. She held. The hold turned the town into glass. In the pause, everything clarified. The keel shadows under boats, the outline of the ferry's regret, the reflection of the radar dish like a white coin no hand had earned. She could see the cat's whiskers articulate arithmetic. She could see her own breath shape itself into something that could be translated without alphabet. Release. The exhale reorganized the weather. The 7 shafts trembled, and new harmonics entered the hum. Thin at first, like distant wires singing in wind, then thicker, until the air crowded with chords no organ could pull off without confessing the blood inside it. The voices in the tape multiplied, grandmothers and brothers, and people who had never owned their names while living. The harmonics didn't decorate, they revealed. The pier groaned, an elder rising carefully to lead the dance, and settled again. Far out where the mouth of the harbor opened to the serious sea, something moved. Not a ship, not a whale, not a shape, more like a decision. "You're part of the count now," the harbor repeated. But this time the sentence arrived with footnotes Juno could feel. Part as in limb, part as in portion, part as in the job she had hated doing as a child, dividing a pie so everyone got enough even when enough wasn't what they wanted. The count wasn't a tally of sinners or saints. It was a balancing of breath, the reckoning of all the inhalations that had never been fully given back to air. She breathed again. So did the town. Somewhere on the hill, a clock that had stopped years ago gave the mercy of a single tick. The beam from the radar returned, swept past, swept back, and then, almost shyly, stayed. It did not interrogate. It illuminated. Where it rested, the fog cleared enough to expose what had always been hiding under light. Hundreds of minuscule motes, not dust, not insects, bright specks the size of a held tear. They drifted upward, not falling or rising so much as reconsidering gravity. Each time a person inhaled, a mote leaned toward them, and when they exhaled, it leaned back, a little exchange of agency made visible. Janine came down the pier without her apron, hair let loose for the first time since photograph of her had lost the right to be dated. She didn't speak. She stepped into the rhythm as if it had been waiting in a coat closet for her to claim it. Behind her came the mailman, clutching nothing, and the teacher, throat bare, and the mechanic with his hands open, not to offer, not to ask, simply to say available. They stood with Juno and Micah, a small congregation without a name, and breathed. The tape reel spun, surrendered to the fact that sometimes a good instrument is only a mirror. The radio's red light stayed steady. Above them, the lighthouse blinked its patience into the skin of fog. The tide rose a finger's width and, with impeccable courtesy, put it back. Somewhere in the dark, something laughed. The tender laugh people keep for babies and strays, to find that the world could be so easily convinced to be gentle again. The laugh did not make sound. It made room. Juno thought suddenly of arithmetic and ledger columns and a wall of light that had once kept cruelly accurate books on the town's behalf. She imagined that wall standing at the edge of the harbor now, its thin lines shaking off the habit of judgment, remembering that a count can be a blessing if it leaves room for surplus. The shafts brightened as if proud of her thought. Her lungs answered with a mercy she hadn't offered herself in years. For a long time, minutes, hours, a span not measured by clocks, the count held. In pause, release. People arrived and added their breath. Others left and took their absence carefully, like a plate carried home in the dark. Even the gulls took up positions along the breakwater and tilted their heads in solemn agreement. The fog smoothed itself flat as a page turned to a hymn everyone knew and no one had been allowed to sing until now. When at last the wind remembered its job and carried the taste of salt back to the mouths that needed it, Juno looked at Micah. He was crying, the undone kind, the good kind, the kind that returns vitamins to places dryness had written off. "We can't keep it," he mouthed, and she understood he meant the moment. He meant that moments aren't barns for storing light. They're windows for letting it pass. "No," she mouthed back. "We can continue it." The harbor agreed. It lowered itself a fraction, slipped the cool of itself back under her boots, and gave the pier its weight again. The 7 shafts thinned, lengthened, learned humility, and then entered the fog without asking anyone to notice. The radar light blinked once for form and face a hill. The tape clicked in a way that suggested it knew when to bow. But before the choreography dispersed, before the town remembered to be a town again, the harbor spoke one more time, not as instruction, not as revelation, but as a vow exchange in a language that had no need of vowels. "You're part of the count now," it said, and every beam, brace, lung, and leaf replied by doing the only thing that proves a vow is real. They breathed. Morning arrived as if someone had gently lifted the town out of sleep, but forgotten to turn the light on. The fog had settled low and warm, draping itself over roofs and railings like it was soaked in memory. The sea had gone glassy, the kind of stillness that makes you think the world has decided to hold its breath again. And underneath it all, beneath the gulls' absent cries, beneath the whisperless motion of trees, there was a soundless ringing, like an echo that refused to end. Not a noise, but an impression of one, a reminder that the air was still recovering from the act of having spoken. Juno didn't remember walking home. She could recall standing on the pier with the others, the way the harbor had moved like a living lung beneath their feet. But after that, nothing, just the sense of having been brought back, the way a letter might be returned to sender. Her boots were damp, her hands streaked with salt as if she'd been touching the tide in her sleep. The hem of her coat smelled faintly of ozone. The tape deck was still running when she found it by her bedside. The wheels spun uselessly, the ribbon clicking softly in a loop, like a clock too shy to tick. That tiny mechanical rhythm was the only sound left in the room, the faint promise of continuity. She pressed stop, then rewind, the motor side the closest thing to comfort. When she pressed play again, her heart stopped. At first, only the hush of wind over water, the kind her microphone sometimes caught by accident. But then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, impossibly deep, as if the air itself had learned to walk. Not hers, not human. Each step carried a pulse, a rhythm she recognized too well, a pattern of short and long, pause, long, short. The same sequence that had glowed beneath the waves, the same she'd heard from the harbor, from the voice that had borrowed her name. She replayed it again and again, trying to find the edges of what she'd captured, but the more she listened, the more it felt like the footsteps weren't moving toward her or away from her. They were circling her, not in threat but in acknowledgement, as if something vast and unseen was pacing just beyond her comprehension, deciding whether to remain myth or memory. Down in town, the day continued in half measures. The diner opened on time, but not with purpose. Conversations rose and felt like half-dreams, starting in one mouth and ending in someone else's. Coffee poured itself without steam, toast browned without scent. Even laughter, when it dared to appear, ended midair, as though the sound had lost permission to finish existing. Juno walked in, tape deck under her arm, and the small brass bell above the door jangled, but only visibly. The motion was there, but not the tone. Janine stood behind the counter, her apron stained with yesterday's coffee. Her hair had come undone. Her voice, when it finally emerged, sounded as though it had been stored somewhere dark. "Did you dream it too?" she asked. Juno looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I think it dreamed us." The words landed gently, but they were truer than either of them wanted to admit. Around them, other patrons nodded, mechanically at first, then with the weariness of confession. They all knew something had reached them in the night, something that wasn't supposed to touch the waking world. At noon, the lighthouse changed. Its beam, normally white, sharp, and precise, shifted to a deep red, not the angry red of warning, but the slow, pulsing kind that feels like breath. The Coast Guard would later issue statements about filament corrosion, electrical surges, the usual mechanical scapegoats. But those who saw it firsthand swore it wasn't light that changed. It was meaning. They said it didn't shine red. It felt red. A heartbeat projected across the bay. Children pointed. Adults watched without blinking. No one moved. By dusk, the fog had returned, thick and golden this time, almost benevolent. The horizon dissolved into it, and Needlepoint became an island of waiting. That was when the hum came back, not from the sky this time, but from beneath. It started in the pipes, a tremor so soft it could have been mistaken for plumbing. Then it deepened, spreading to the floorboards, through the walls, into the teeth, People paused mid-sentence as their own bodies became tuning forks. Every glass in needlepoint quivered, every mirror fogged. The clocks advanced 3 minutes without moving their hands. The sound was neither threat nor warning. It was summoning. Juno left the diner, following the vibration through the fog. Each step she took felt guided, not by instinct but by recognition. Her pulse synchronized with the hum, until she couldn't tell which belonged to her. She moved past the post office, the library, the hill where the radar dish stood dormant like a closed eyelid, and then further toward the ridge. When she reached it, the air was luminous, not with brightness, but with presence. The ridge was awake again, its veins glowing faintly gold beneath the fog, as though molten light had been trapped in its stone for centuries and was only now remembering the way out. The sound grew clearer the closer she came. It stopped being vibration and became speech, a kind of communication that bypassed language and went straight to comprehension. "You heard us," the voice said, not with words, but with understanding. "Now listen back." Juno froze. The sentence didn't echo in her ears, but in her bones. She realized suddenly that her silence wasn't absence. It was response. The fog parted for a moment, and she saw the town below, not as buildings or streets, but as a map of moving light. Lines and spirals of gold connected one rooftop to another, like living constellations breathing in time. Every person, every heartbeat, was a thread of brightness in the dark fabric of the world. The town wasn't being haunted. It was participating. She saw it all from above, though her feet never left the ground. The light moved through people like air through reeds, and every time someone inhaled, a small flare ignited within them. Some were faint, some brilliant, but all were connected. Then she noticed something impossible. Some of those lights, maybe half, were humming her name, not Juno as a sound, but the pattern of her name, the vibration of it, as if the ridge, the sea, and the fog all remember her not as a person, but as a frequency. Her eyes blurred. She wasn't afraid. She was recognized. The hum crescendoed, not in volume but in intimacy, until it pressed against the inside of her thoughts. Her body felt like a radio being tuned. The warmth under her ribs spread, and she felt a pull, not physical, not gravitational, but emotional, the way a melody pulls you toward the note it's about to become. Then, without fanfare, the ridge exhaled. The fog folded back on itself, closing like a curtain. The glow retreated beneath the stone. The vibration dissipated into stillness. The hum stopped. What replaced it wasn't silence. It was expectation. The kind of stillness a choir takes before the downbeat, the shared pause before everything begins again. Juno stood there for a long time, unsure whether the encounter had ended or only changed shape. The air smelled faintly of iron and rain. She could feel something watching, not with eyes, but with patience. She looked back toward town. The windows glowed faintly, not with light, but with pulse. The red of the lighthouse blinked once, then dimmed back to white, as if remembering its duty, but unwilling to forget the dream. And in that transition, Juno understood something wordless but clear. Whatever they had awakened, it wasn't gone. It had simply chosen to listen now. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Her voice would have been redundant. Somewhere beyond the fog, the tide turned quietly, the sound like an eyelid closing for the first time in years. Needlepoint inhaled, and for the first time since the beginning, the air exhaled back. By the next morning, Needlepoint had started to split in two. Not physically. There were no cracks in the pavement, no cliffs dividing the streets, but something deeper had divided. Time itself. Half the town woke to clocks that refused to move past 8:14 a.m. breakfast plates, sat untouched, eggs cooling mid-fork, and yet the light outside told a different story, static, eternal morning. The other half of the town swore they watched the sun set twice already, the sky collapsing into gold and back again as if caught in indecision. No one argued about what was true, because somehow, impossibly, both versions were. Juno walked to the fog-drowned streets, and as she passed each house, she realized the fracture wasn't just temporal. It was perceptual. Each window she looked into reflected a different hour. One showed dawn, pale and promising. Another, the harsh silver noon. Another, the bruised calm of dusk. and in some, a color she had never seen before, deep blue with veins of gold, like twilight trying to dream itself into being. The fog made everything elastic. Sound stretched. Footsteps arrived before their owners. Voices came half a second late, like thoughts spoken out of order. Juno's breath clouded before her mouth opened, as though the air anticipated her. The cat followed her, tail low, its fur lifting with static that hummed faintly in time with something she couldn't quite hear, but could feel. It was the same pulse from before, the hum, the vibration that lived underground. Every few steps, the air trembled like a curtain brushed by unseen hands, and distortions shimmered where the mist grew thin. Not people, not ghosts, just presences, ripples of the world folding over itself. It was as if space had grown a heartbeat. When Juno reached Main Street, the fog parted slightly, and the diner emerged from it like a ship returning from nowhere. The neon sign flickered, colors unsure which hour to serve. Inside, Janine stood behind the counter, her hands shaking as she poured coffee that no longer steamed. Her reflection in the window lagged half a second behind her, and when she blinked, it didn't. "I heard it in my dreams," Janine said, her voice thin, frayed. "The hum?" Juno asked. No, Janine looked up, eyes glassy. The pause between hums. It was saying my name. The words made the air shift. Somewhere, a fork dropped and hit the floor, but the sound arrived out of order, echoing before the metal touched the tile. The room seemed tense, as though the diner itself were holding its breath. Then the radio on the counter began to move. It didn't jump. It slid an inch to the left, scraping lightly against the Formica. No one touched it. The dial turned itself until it reached channel 3. The static that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed, measured and deliberate. Then, from the speaker, 3 names. Juno, Janine, Micah. Each syllable was distinct, but they didn't sound like voices. They sounded like chords, layer vibrations of air that bent the light as they spoke. The room darkened slightly. The napkin holder rattled. The sugar packets trembled in their metal caddy. The very air seemed to grow dense, folding inward on itself, the hum compacting into something physical. Outside, every dog in needlepoint howled once, a perfect single tone, and then fell silent all at once, as if cut by an unseen conductor. The silence afterward wasn't absence. It was breath. The town inhaled. And then came the exhale. A sound like breathing passed through needlepoint, not above it, not beneath it, but through it. Curtains fluttered. Streetlights flickered. Windows fogged from the inside out. The world didn't move as one. It breathed as one. Juno clutched the counter to steady herself. She could feel her bones ring, a low vibration that resonated through her teeth. It wasn't pain, it was recognition. Like a tuning fork finally finding its note. Micah burst through the door, drenched in fog and seawater. His eyes were wide, pupils blown wide like he'd stared into lightning. "The radar's spinning again," he gasped. Janine turned toward him. "The ridge." Micah shook his head, voice trembling. "No, it's not facing the ridge anymore." "Then where?" Juno asked, though she already felt the answer building in her chest. He swallowed. "Down." The word fell into the room and stayed there, heavy as stone. "Down," Juno echoed, her throat dry. Micah nodded. "It's pointing straight into ground, like it's listening for something buried." Outside, the fog pulsed again once, twice, 3 times, each beat glowing gold-white before fading. The glow matched the rhythm of the hum. Even the shadows moved in sync with it, like reflections without mirrors. Janine whispered, "It's alive." Juno moved to the window. Beneath the fog, she could see the outlines of the street, the faint shimmer of light beneath the pavement. The earth itself looked like it was remembering something. The asphalt flexed subtly, breathing in shallow tremors. Then beneath her feet, a new sound rose, soft, layered, haunting. Voices. They came not from the sky or sea, but below, faint at first, like wind through hollow stone. Then clearer, a murmuring tide that formed into a phrase repeated again and again. "We stayed. We stayed. We stayed." The voices weren't pleading. They weren't angry. They were tired, centuries tired, bone-deep tired. It was the sound of people who had never left because the ground itself hadn't let them go. The diner shook as the hum deepened. Glasses rattled on shelves. Spoons jittered in their cups. The world didn't feel dangerous. It felt occupied. Micah stepped closer to the window. "It's not the dead," he whispered. "It's the town." Juno understood what he meant. Needle Point wasn't being haunted. It was the haunting. It had lived so long beside its own silence that it had learned to keep breathing after its voice was gone. The hum, the fog, the red light, none of it was invasion. It was memory resurfacing. The air shimmered violently now. Outside, the lamppost bent ever so slightly, as if bowing toward the earth. The fog thickened, swirling around the diner's foundation like a rising tide. For a heartbeat, Juno saw something beneath it. Outlines of streets that no longer existed, homes made of wood and lanterns, people moving like faint echoes of their descendants. Needlepoint's past was superimposed over its present, both flickering, phasing in and out of one another like frames of film out of sync. The cat hissed, back arched, fur bristling, and in the window's reflection, its eyes shone gold, the same shade as the ridge veins. Outside, the hum reached its apex. The fog pulsed, brighter now, gold bleeding into white. The sound filled every space in the diner, pressing against the walls like a tide rising too fast. The coffee cups sang softly, the spoons chiming in harmony. And then silence. A silence so profound it hummed on its own. The fog swelled once more, rolling over Main Street, swallowing lampposts, rooftops, the edges of everything. The diner's lights flickered and steadied, casting the last visible glow for miles. From somewhere beneath them, far below the streets, beneath rock and sea and time, the voices rose again, steady and resolute. We stayed. We stayed. We stayed. Not as lament, not as curse, but as a promise. The fog closed over the windows, and the world outside disappeared. For one fragile moment, Needlepoint existed in two places at once, its past breathing through its present, its future waiting for its next inhale. And in the heartbeat between those breaths, Juno realized something terrible and beautiful at once. The town wasn't breaking. It was becoming whole. That night, Juno stayed in her grandmother's house at the edge of the woods, where the ground rose unevenly toward the ridge as if the hill had been stitched there by a shaking hand. The house was old enough to remember wars and storms, and the kind of quiet that lingers after both. Floorboards had learned every weight by heart. Doors inhaled before opening, and the pipes occasionally confessed a history you couldn't flush. It had begun to hum along with everything else. Faintly at first, like a moth in a drawer, then with the soft insistence of a lullaby no one claimed to know. The rooms wore their years with a decency Juno had always trusted. Crochet blankets draped over chair arms like obedient clouds. A jar of buttons, mother-of-pearl bone Bakelite, waited on the sill, each keeping the shape of a coat long gone. The clock over the mantel was 2 minutes slow, the way it had been the day her grandmother died. No one corrected it, because grief prefers familiar mistakes. Tonight the clock's hands trembled without moving, as if the second hand wasn't a measure, but a listener. The mirrors no longer held reflections. Instead, they showed fragments of light drifting behind glass like distant fish, half curious, half afraid. Each fragment pulsed to the rhythm of the tone beneath the soil, a low, patient thrum that made the house feel less like wood and more like an instrument being tuned. When Juno moved, the fragments adjusted, not to her body, but to the space her breath claimed. Sometimes they aligned and suggested her outline. More often they rearranged into patterns she recognized without knowing why. A spiral her grandmother used to draw on the margins of recipes, the outline of the harbor at low tide, the stitch called feather that held a fraying cuff for 20 winters. She set her bag down beside the couch and listened. The hum was everywhere and nowhere, under the rug, inside the walls, braided to the rafters. It was impossible to locate and impossible to ignore. She turned on the lamp beside the sofa. The shade answered with faint glow not quite its own, as if the light bulb had remembered a previous life as sunlight through leaves. Juno sat in the living room with the taped deck in her lap. The same battered deck her father had nursed through adolescence, heartbreak, and summer thunderstorms. The play button's edge was chewed from a childhood, a wanting to replay a moment immediately. She pressed record, not expecting sound, just wanting proof of her own heartbeat. The reels began to turn, the machine whirred, soft and obedient. The small red eye lit as if it had been waiting for permission when she pressed stop and then play back. The recording began before she had touched the button. There was no leader hiss, no mechanical throat clearing. Her own voice arrived, close as breath, intimate as a thought you swear you never formed. "You came back too early," she whispered. The sentence didn't scold. It consoled. It sounded like a warning from someone who had already forgiven the inevitable disobedience. Juno swallowed. The mouth that made the voice felt like hers, and not hers. The timbre correct, the cadence wrong, as if a memory had worn her vocal cords like a borrowed coat. The air grew warmer. Not by degrees, by mood. The curtains swayed though the windows were closed, a slow, tidal movement that had more to do with listening than wind. Somewhere in the bones of the house a board released a long-held breath. The sound ran through the joists like relief. Upstairs, a light flickered in her grandmother's old sewing room, the one that had stayed locked since the funeral. The smell of ozone drifted down the stairs, braided with lilac from a sachet last replaced when the price of milk had 2 digits and with salt the air had kept for the right sentence. Juno stood, the tape deck still in her hands, and felt the uneven rhythm of the carpet underfoot, where a nail head had always been proud and a floorboard bowed to accommodate a lifetime of turning. She placed the deck on the coffee table, where it continued to purr like a cat respectful of holy things. She climbed the steps slowly, palms sliding along the banister polished into a river by other hands. The floorboard sighed beneath her, not complaint but surrender, the creak of a house that had learned the posture of waiting and the manners of grief. Between the 3rd and 4th stair, the hum in her chest matched the hum in the walls. The beat caught and held like a stitch on a needle. She paused there, without knowing why, the way her grandmother used to pause to thread. At the landing, the light was different, warmer, richer, almost golden. The door to the sewing room stood at the end of the hall. Paint cracked in hairline constellations. The old key hung from a ribbon on a nail above the frame. It had not been there before. As she reached for it, the door unlatched and swung inward, not abruptly, but with theatrical courtesy, as if a stagehand had been waiting for her cue since the last act of a play no one remembered buying tickets to. Inside, the room was filled with threads. Hundreds, maybe thousands, stretched across the walls and ceiling in taut lines, anchored to pins that had not existed yesterday. Some threads were thin as breath, others the width of a hair, all of them glowing faintly gold. They crossed and layered, looped and returned, forming a pattern, a topographic map of the town, but alive, shifting. Streets traced themselves in filament. The harbor curved in a brace of light. The ridge rose, pulsing, its veins brighter than the rest, like a beacon drawn by a careful hand. Each line vibrated with a low, resonant hum. When she stepped farther in, the threads shifted as if to accommodate her, loosening here, tightening there, the room adjusting its loom to include her angle of attention. She lifted a hand, but did not touch. A sagging loop near the window pulled itself taut as though embarrassed to be seen slouching. In the center of the web stood a shape made of light. It wasn't human, not entirely. It borrowed the idea of a person, as a child's drawing borrows the idea of a house. Its outline flickered between forms. Sometimes a woman, sometimes a tall question, sometimes a knot of brightness that had learned to stand. When it moved, the air bent around it like sound through water, softening edges, making the room suddenly more round. "Why me?" Juno asked. The words were threadbare, barely a breath. "Because you listened," it said, without moving a mouth or what might have been a mouth. The voice did not arrive from the center of it, but from the room itself, as if every thread had been given a syllable and the answer was their chorus. "Because you remembered the pause." The pause. Not the tone, not the light, not the spectacle. The gap that made meaning possible. She felt her lungs recognize a compliment, like a student praised for a small discipline long mocked as timidity. The golden threads began to move. Not wildly, methodically, the way a careful seamstress repositions pins without taking her finger off the fabric. Each tightened slightly, pulling the town's shape into sharper focus. Juno watched streets sharpen, alleys appear. A footpath climbed the ridge and stopped, as it always had at the chain-link fence, which here gleamed like a cautery of stars. She saw the diner wink, with a shy pulse. The harbor brightened as if water had remembered fire. The radar tower drew itself with a stubborn line, then rotated a degree and a half as if to say, "I've been paying attention this whole time, and none of you asked me what I knew." Houses she had never entered announced their rooms in small blinks. A piano with 3 keys dead, a crib turned into a bookcase, a coat left hanging since a winter that never ended. And then she saw something beneath it all. A circle. Huge. Breathing. It was not a hole, but presence shaped like one, an absence made muscular. It pulsed in time with the buried hum, exhaling light that traveled up the threads and across the map of needlepoint like news that could not wait for morning. The circle was so big I kept losing it, the way a person loses a sea by trying to fit it into a glance. "Is that—" she began, throat dry. "It's what's left," the voice replied, "of what tried to speak before you had words." Her grandmother's sewing chair sat in the corner, empty but not unoccupied. The cushion bore a familiar depression, as if someone had stood up moments before she entered. On the old oak table lay her grandmother's tin of notions, lid ajar, measuring tape spilling like a tame river. The little tomato pincushion was pierced with new pins she had never seen. Their heads were not glass but tiny lenses, and through each lens a fleck of light blinked in the rhythm of the ridge. Juno moved closer to the circle represented in thread. As she did, the low hum separated into overtones the way a chord blooms when you change your angle in a church. There were voices in it, not distinct, not conversational, just the idea of voices, layered and patient. She knew, with the unearned certainty of a dream, that if she leaned too close, the map would enlarge to meet her, and she could step into the circle and never find the edge again. "Before we had words," she said, trying a thought on for honesty. "What did we have?" The shape of light considered her. The thread stilled. "Breath," the room answered. "And counting. Counting." "The mercy of number," the voice said gently. "The making of enough when there was not enough to name." The sewing machine in the corner shivered, without moving. Juno remembered being a child on the floor, sorting buttons while her grandmother turned old shirts into quilts. "We make do," her grandmother had said, not unkindly. "We make do by making." Juno's eyes burned. "And the circle?" "A lung," the voice said. "An oath. A remainder. Choose the word that hurts least." A breeze moved through a room with no open windows. The threads lifted in a small wave that traveled the walls and returned to the doorframe, where it paused as if waiting for permission to leave, and then chose to stay. In the mirror above the sewing table, the fragments of light assembled into a face. Not her grandmother's face, not hers, but a blend of kindnesses she had known, the average of all the ways she had been forgiven. It looked at her without accusation. It looked at her as if there were still time to choose correctly. "You came back too early," her recorded voice had said. What would on time have been? Juno asked now. When the room answered, it did so by rearranging itself. The thread slackened a fraction, then tightened into a map of needlepoint brightened at 7 points. The pier, the diner, the church steps, the elementary school auditorium, the trailhead at Cemetery Hill, the empty cannery, the small clearing behind this very house where her grandmother's laundry line still hung like a staff waiting for its notes. The 7 points pulsed together, then one after the other, forming a rhythm she knew how to breathe. 4, 3, rest. 4, 3, rest. On time is when we are ready, the voice said at last. On time is when the listener learns to become the instrument. She wanted to ask a simpler question, because those are easier to bear. Was it you on the recording? Yes, said the room. And no, it was the part of you that knows how to return an echo without needing to own the first sound. Juno laughed once, and the sound startled her. It arrived on time, warm, alive. The fragments in the mirror flickered like proud minnows. Downstairs, the clock gave a brave little tick, and then thought better of it. The shape of light shifted again, less person now, more loom. The threads drew tighter, not threatening, not closing, focusing. Juno watched as a new, finer filament wove itself under the map like a secret stitch. along the ditch where old children hid from new rules, over the culvert where Micah had once fixed a radio with a bobby pin, under the diner booth where Janine kept a faint pencil mark to prove she'd been taller at 16 than the boy who later left town to sell storms to places that didn't need them. Each filament touched the place that held a pause, and when it touched, the room sighed. Her grandmother's thimble rolled gently across the table to the edge of a paper pattern. It tapped once. "Pay attention here." "I'm trying," Juno said. "We know," the room replied, and the we was large in the house, large in the ridge, large enough even to include the embarrassment of being loved. For the first time since she'd entered, she noticed a window. It looked west toward the line where the woods surrendered to meadow. Snow had begun to fall, not the brash, noisy kind that clings to lashes, but slow, tentative flakes descending as if afraid to land on a world still deciding whether it was awake. Each flake caught the gold of the threads and carried it for a moment, a tiny lantern accepting an errand. Juno reached toward the nearest filament. She didn't touch it. Something in her knew not to, but she let her hand hover until warmth lived between palm and light. The thread thrummed softly, and from somewhere below the floor she felt the answering thrum of the circle. The two pulses braided, and for an instant the house felt taller, the roof farther from the earth, the air less obligated to gravity. "What happens if we pull?" she asked. "Things come together," said the voice, "or apart. Sewing and unsuing share emotion. Intention decides a name." The figure flickered once, then again, the flicker widening into a brief absence that revealed a far wall behind it. Juno glimpsed, for a heartbeat, something like a shore made of darkness and teeth of light, a geography too large for the room that none the less fit, because the room had learned how to be generous. The threads dimmed, not to nothing, only to rest. The hum lowered itself like a shade. The shape dissolved into the pattern it had made, the way a teacher vanishes into a lesson when it's time to leave the students alone together. "Wait," Juno said, though she didn't know what she meant to ask her to wait for. "You came back too early," the recording had said. "Then when should I?" But the room had already returned her to herself. The pins were ordinary again. The tomato cushion wore only dull steel heads. The map of light kept its outline but learned humility. The circle at the bottom of everything slowed its breath to the pace of winter. A small noise from the hallway, soft, padded. Then the cat appeared tail high, eyes reflecting two perfect coins of threadlight. It stepped into the room, considered the nearest filament with professional curiosity, and sat beneath it like an ornament placed correctly at last. Juno laughed again, and this time the room allowed itself to be proud of the timing. She stood for a while, hands in her pockets, learning the shape of the silence. When she turned to leave, she noticed the dress formed by the wardrobe was wearing the half-finished muslin her grandmother had been fitting the spring the river rose. The basting stitches, loose, temporary, glowed faintly. She ran a fingertip along one seam and felt the tiniest tug at her own sternum, as if her bones had been basted to this place long ago. Downstairs, the tape deck clicked to itself, a contented animal in a nest of wires. The house had resumed its responsible noises. The radiator's low hum, the refrigerator's embarrassed cough. Juno pulled the sewing room door until it almost latched, leaving a crack wide enough for a light the thickness of thread to follow her. On the landing she paused. Snow laid itself down on the world without hurry. In the closest mirror, the fragments had arranged into a plain truth. Her face, tired and lifted within by a kindness she could not claim to have earned. For once, the sight didn't startle her. She nodded to the version of herself that had learned to stay during the count. The smell of lilac and salt and a clean scorch, ozone, trailed her down the stairs. She placed the tape deck back on the coffee table and sat with her elbows on her knees, palms together the way her grandmother prayed when she was only trying to remember a list. The red record light winked once as if in solidarity and then stilled. Outside, the first snow of the season kept falling, each flake descending in a posture of consideration, as if asking permission from ground. The yard blurred into the field into the slope into the ridge where veins of gold had already decided to keep their secret until the town remembered how to ask a better question. Juno leaned back and let the hum of the house say good night to the hum of the earth. Somewhere beneath her feet, the circle turned once, the slow revolution of something that refused to forget the breath that made it. She closed her eyes. The pause met her there, an open hand, and in that soft, measurable darkness, between the last stitch of the day and the first stitch of the dream, needlepoint breathed, and she breathed with it, and the snow agreed to keep what it had learned. By dawn, Juno couldn't tell if the humming had truly stopped or if her ears had simply learned to carry in silence. The absence of sound had acquired its own resonance, a phantom vibration that lived beneath thought, steady as breath. When she moved her head, the air seemed to thrum just behind her skull, as though the world had transferred its rhythm into her bones, leaving her body to keep time on behalf of the earth. The snow had settled overnight, but not naturally. It lay in uneven sheets that curved and gathered like fabric pulled across something breathing. The ridge shimmered faintly, veiled in white that refused to touch certain areas. It was as if the snow itself recognized boundaries invisible to human eyes, arcs and spirals and concentric rings where heat pulsed beneath the frozen crust. Beneath the morning light, those untouched sections glowed through the frost, soft veins of gold pulsing in patient intervals. Juno stood at the window for a long time, boots in hand, watching her breath rise and fold into the air. The world outside seemed paused, not dead, not asleep, but listening. Even the trees leaned slightly toward the ridge, as if waiting for instructions. She pulled on her coat and stepped outside. The cold bit at her face, but didn't sting. The air carried a faint sweetness, metallic and electric, like snow that remembered thunder. She followed one of the glowing outlines up the hill. Her boots crunched through the untouched frost until, without warning, the ground softened beneath her. The snow gave way to trembling soil that felt alive. It was warm, not in patches, but everywhere. Each step sank slightly, the earth rising and falling beneath her weight like a slow, deliberate inhale. She crouched, pressed her gloved hand to the dirt, and felt it thud once, faint but certain. A heartbeat. The earth was breathing in rhythms older than the wind. She didn't speak. She didn't dare. Every few steps the pulse came again, steady as a memory too large to belong to one being. Halfway up the ridge, she saw a shape moving through the fog. Micah. He looked hollowed out by sleeplessness, face raw from wind, holding a dented thermos that steamed faintly though its lid was gone. His eyes flickered toward her with the strange calm of someone who'd already decided disbelief was useless. "They're still under there," he said. His voice was too quiet to disturb the air. "The radar picked up heartbeats last night, not human ones." Juno stopped beside him. Could be machinery. Micah shook his head slowly, his hand tightening around the empty thermos. "Machines don't wait," he said. "These have been waiting for a long time." The words hung between them, visible in the cold. For a moment neither spoke. The hum beneath the soil filled the silence between their thoughts. They began to climb again, following the uneven trail that led toward the old signal station, the one Juno's grandmother had worked at during the war, when needlepoint still believed the sky needed guarding. The building emerged from the fog like a relic exhumed from another century. Its roof sagged, half-collapsed, but the radio mast still stood, skeletal and defiant, wrapped in ice that glittered faintly gold. Inside, the air was thick with dust and static. The walls sweated rust. The floor creaked under snowmelt. A tangle of old transmission cables coiled across the floor like black veins returning to a forgotten heart. The main console sat against the far wall, metal worn to a dull sheen, knobs long frozen in place. The dials were dark, except for one. A single gauge still trembled. Its needle twitched irregularly, caught between frequencies no radio should read. Juno stepped closer. The faint vibration in the air sharpened. She could hear whispers in the static now, so quiet they seemed to arrive from inside her skull rather than through the air. She adjusted the volume. The voices grew clearer, layered on top of each other like pages of an unbound book, half erased and overlapping. And then she began to recognize them. The first was her grandmother's, low, composed, carrying that deliberate gentleness she used when teaching Juno to thread a needle. It spoke in fragments, weather patterns, tides, names she hadn't heard in years. Then Janine's voice came, trembling but firm. Then Micah's. And finally, her own, Her name repeated twice. The second time, it came through his breath, almost pleading. Micah paled. Is it recording us? I think it's remembering us, Juno said. She leaned closer, watching the gauge tremble. Its movement wasn't random, it was rhythmic, alive. The needle shifted with intent, swinging back and forth in a pattern she recognized. Not Morse code, not language. A pulse. The same sequence she had felt beneath the ridge, the same rhythm that had haunted her sleep since the diner, since the fog first spoke. Then the needle froze, holding still at the midpoint. The console's dead speaker crackled once, and through the static came a voice, not heard but implied, as if the air translated vibration into thought. If you unbury it, the voice said, you will become part of it. The words rippled through the room, sinking into their bones. Juno froze. Her hand hovered over the console, skin prickling as though she'd been touched by static from within. Micah swallowed. His breath fogged the cold air. What happens if we don't? The answer came immediately, steady and calm. Then you'll keep dreaming it. The station seemed to inhale. The floor groaned, a deep, deliberate sound that wasn't decay, but movement. Beneath them, the ridge adjusted itself, the kind of slow tectonic shift that made time feel soft. Outside, the snow began to move. It didn't fall or melt, it rippled. A silent shockwave rolled outward across the valley, lifting drifts into the air and setting them down again in spirals, as though the wind were tracing something too immense for comprehension. Juno and Micah ran to the doorway. The fog was retreating, peeling back from the ridge like breath from glass. What it revealed stole the rest of their air. The earth below wasn't rock at all. Where the ridge had split open, the soil exposed a vast surface beneath, smooth, curved, metallic, though not any metal she'd ever seen. It shimmered like a mirror beneath the snow, but its reflection was wrong. It didn't show the sky. It showed movement, golden veins, faint and pulsing, arranged in symmetrical patterns that radiated outward from a single center point. The entire ridge glowed like the circuit board of some ancient, living mechanism. Juno stepped forward, half in awe, half in dread. The hum beneath her feet was now visible, a vibration made flesh. Lines of gold light ran beneath the metallic surface, pulsing outward in a slow, breathing rhythm. Micah exhaled shakily. It's alive. Juno shook her head, eyes fixed on the pattern. No, she whispered. It's remembering. And she understood, suddenly, with a clarity that burned cold. The hum wasn't under needlepoint. It was needlepoint. The town, the streets, the harbor, the hill, was sitting on a lid of something vast and deliberate. Not a machine, not entirely. Something older than invention. Something that waited. The signal station vibrated behind them, its dead equipment coming faintly to life. Every broken light flickered once. Pale gold. The gauge on the console began to twitch again, faster now, keeping pace with the rhythm from below. The fog shifted. The valley trembled. And as the first edge of sunlight broke through the cloud cover, the golden lines beneath the snow began to open. They unfolded, not like machinery, but like a living thing stretching awake. The pattern widened, forming spirals and ribs, the beginnings of a colossal design etched beneath their world. A single beam of sunlight struck the ridge, and the gold beneath the snow answered. It flared, sudden and blinding, like an eye waking in slow motion. The snow around it melted instantly. The soil glowed from within. And for the briefest instant, Juno felt something pass through her. Not a sound, not a touch, but a recognition. The hum inside her bones synchronized with the rhythm below, and she understood what her grandmother's voice on the tape had meant. If you unbury it, you will become part of it. Because the thing beneath the ridge wasn't asking to be found. It was asking to be finished. And as the sun climbed higher, needlepoint began to shine from underneath. Streets, roofs, even the sea itself lit faintly with that same buried gold. The horizon pulsed once, and in that tremor, she realized something terrible and true. The town wasn't built on the ridge. The ridge was the town's heart, and it was waking up. The ridge opened quietly, like an animal stretching after a long sleep. No roar split the morning, no quake threatened the ground. just a slow, deliberate widening of the golden lines beneath the thinning snow until they formed a single, perfect circle, bright enough to erase the edges of dawn. It was not destruction but disclosure, a careful unfurling, as though the earth had been holding its breath for centuries and was finally willing to exhale. Juno and Micah stood at the summit, blinded and breathless. The light wasn't harsh. It didn't attack the eyes. It searched. It pressed against the skin instead of burning through it. As if looking for a door, it felt like being read. The warmth seeped into their coats, their ribs, their thoughts. For an instant, Juno forgot where her hands ended and the air began. The air changed first. It stopped being air and became attention. The wind, which had been coming from the sea, stilled, then shifted upward, rising vertically like smoke from an unseen pyre. It carried with it the scent of iron and rain, the metallic promise of storm that hadn't yet decided whether it would fall. Every leaf in the valley turned its underside to the sky. Trees trembled in synchrony, not from cold but recognition. Something beneath them was remembering how to breathe. The snow didn't melt. It evaporated, dissolving into ribbons of steam that moved like thought underwater. The mist curled and wove into the air, tracing the same spirals that had been etched into the ridge moments before. The valley became translucent. The ground pulsed faintly, as if revealing its heartbeat in intervals of gold and white. Micah's voice broke the hush. "I think it's reading us." Juno blinked, still watching the light crawl over her boots. "Reading?" He nodded, eyes unfocused. "Names, memories, things that way." The words hung in the air, made visible by the gold dust that had begun to rise from the soil. The ridge pulsed again, and Juno felt something in her chest, an internal pressure that wasn't pain but invitation. Her pulse synchronized with the vibration underfoot. For the first time, she understood what it meant for a mountain to breathe. The light intensified, swallowing the last traces of blue from the sky. Within it, shapes began to appear, not bodies, not even faces, but possibilities of faces. They were made of motion, their edges defined by the way the air bent around them. Each shimmered with a resonance that tugged at her bones. Every time one turned, Juno felt a pull in her chest, a fleeting gravity that brought tears to her eyes before she knew why. They weren't strangers. The first shape resolved enough for her to recognize the curve of a smile she'd seen in a photograph. Micah's father, who'd vanished on the boats 20 years ago. Another shimmered into the soft outline of her grandmother. Face composed, patient, eyes luminous with the quiet authority of those who have waited too long to speak. More followed. The boy who had drowned near the pier, the teacher who had gone missing during the flood. Even the nameless faces from framed photos left behind in the diner. None of them looked alive. They looked remembered, as if the ridge had pulled their silhouettes from the stored light of the world and was playing them back in motion. Juno's throat closed around a breath that wanted to be a question. The air around her thickened with static. The tape recorder in her coat pocket began to vibrate. She pulled it out. It was old, heavy, its casing cold despite the surrounding warmth. The reels turned on their own, unwinding a sound that shouldn't have been there. Not static, not music. A voice. Her grandmother's voice. "You're where I stopped listening." The sound filled the air like an answered prayer. Micah turned toward her, startled, but Juno barely saw him. Her vision shimmered. The ridge blurred into light. She looked down, and suddenly the valley unfolded, not as landscape but as pattern. The golden thread she had seen in the sewing room stretched outward beneath her, enormous now, luminous veins connecting every building, every person, every unspoken memory. The diner pulsed faintly. The harbor shimmered in rhythm. The church bell tower glowed within like a lantern. The light wasn't falling on needlepoint. It was coming from it. Each structure, each living thing, was part of the design. Every sound, every heartbeat, every silence had been absorbed into the pattern and now radiated outward. Juno realized that the ridge was not awakening alone. It was awakening with them. Micah sank to his knees. His breath came in shallow bursts, his eyes reflecting the same golden current. Tears cut clean lines through the dirt on his face. "What do we do?" he whispered. Juno watched the horizon, where the light was no longer spreading. It was rising. It grew not like dawn, but like the memory of one, "Maybe nothing," she said softly. "Maybe this is what happens when remembering goes too far." The words tasted like truth, heavy and familiar. The ground vibrated again. The light swelled, pushing shadows backward until there was nowhere left for them to stand. From beneath the ridge came a sound, not the hum that had haunted their nights, but a new tone, deeper, layered, alive. It wasn't one voice, it was thousands. Men and women, children, wind, machinery, waves, all assembled into one vast exhale that carried meaning without language. The voice spoke, not in syllables but in recognition. "You've all been speaking," it said, not aloud but through the skin, through the spaces between atoms. "Now listen to what silence built in your absence." The words settled into the marrow of the valley. Juno's vision expanded. The circle beneath their feet had widened beyond sight, golden lines threading outward until they met the sea. The harbor reflected the pattern perfectly, as if the water had turned to glass. Birds hovered midair, suspended in the updraft. Even the waves seemed to hesitate. Then came the answering sound, soft, immense, and from above. The sky, too, had begun to glow. At first, it was only the light of dawn catching moisture in the air, but then the clouds parted with precision, forming concentric arcs of pale fire. The upper atmosphere shimmered like a mirror. For a second, the earth's pattern and the sky's reflection aligned, and the hum bridged between them. It was unbearable and perfect. The kind of sound you don't hear so much as join. Every object in the valley vibrated in unison. The windows in the houses, the spoons in their drawers, the people inside their dreams. For one long, sacred moment, all divisions between sound and silence collapsed. Juno could feel the words before she could think them. This wasn't the world remembering something lost. This was the world finishing a sentence it had started long before language existed. Micah's lips moved, but no sound came out. He looked at her, face wet, mouth forming the word please without knowing what he was asking for. The golden light climbed his chest, wrapping around his ribs like a second pulse. Juno felt the same warmth radiate through her palms. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from comprehension. Needlepoint wasn't being consumed. It was being translated. Every building, every road, every buried relic was part of a syntax too vast for human scale. The town had been written in the earth as a memory, and the ridge was now reading it aloud. The air shimmered again, the light pressing harder. Around them, the shapes, the luminous echoes of the dead, turned their faces upward toward the sound. They began to dissolve one by one, as if their outlines were being redrawn by the wind. The tape recorder in Juno's hand grew warm. Her grandmother's voice returned, fainter now, fading with every pulse of gold. "The threads were never to hold," it said. "They were to teach you where to listen." Then the reel stopped spinning. Juno closed her eyes. The ridge vibrated once more, deep enough to shift the heartbeat of the mountain itself. She could feel the resonance echo through the water table, the roots of the trees, the bones of the dead. The light expanded until it wasn't light at all anymore. It was awareness, filling every molecule with a memory of having existed. When the voice finally fell silent, it left behind a quiet so profound it felt structural, like the world's original blueprint had been revealed. And for the first time in recorded history, the sky answered. It flashed once, gold meeting gold. The cloud sang, not thunder, not wind, but a low, harmonic tone that joined the hum below. The ridge and the heavens synchronized, two halves of the same buried chord. Juno felt herself pulled upward, not physically but conceptually, lifted into the pattern. Every particle of her being vibrated with the realization that there had never been separation, only forgetting. The valley was alive. The ridge was awake. The air was full of listening. And as the last of the fog burned away, Needlepoint ceased to be a town for a moment. It became what it had always been, a bridge between the sound that built the world and the silence that was kind enough to let it finish. O ChatGPT Ds. It began as a shimmer at the horizon, a gentle, translucent curtain rising from the edge of the ocean, as if the sea were exhaling light. At first it looked like heat over a road, a mirage that refused to make up its mind. The townspeople watched from their porches, from the diner's fog windows, from the gaps between drawn curtains where the cautious and the hopeful share the same narrow view. Someone at the harbor cut his engine and drifted. Another killed her porch light without thinking. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't aurora. It was language, written in light too slow for the human eye to catch all at once. A slow script the sky traced and retraced until even doubt began to read. The sky was answering. Juno felt it in her teeth before she saw it. A pressure, a bright ache along the jaw, the same low vibration that once came from her grandmother's radio when the tubes were warm and the station was far, now vibrating through her bones, as if the skeleton had learned to become a tuning fork. The fillings in her molars rang. The air behind her eyes grew clear. Micah steadied himself with both palms on the ground, pulling steadiness up through his arms like water from a pump. He whispered numbers under his breath, not to count down to anything but to agree with the rhythm already happening. "It's rhythm," he muttered. 4, 3, 2, 1, then pause. And the pause mattered. In that breath between pulses, the world seemed to catch and hold its balance, like a tightrope walker placing a foot where gravity hadn't decided yet. The fog stopped moving. The air lost its chill. A string on the church piano trembled and then chose mercy. Even the gulls, those tireless litigators of the mundane, suspended mid-flight and froze, as if waiting for the next word in a language their bodies had always known. The bay flattened to glass. The light on the water did not travel but settled, like snow that had chosen to be light instead. Then the ridge spoke, not with thunder. Thunder is a closing argument. The ridge spoke like a library opening its doors. The golden circle widened, not like a door, doors divide, but like a memory unsealing itself, air lifting from old paper. Lines that had been mere veins spread outward and upward, and from them rose columns of light. Thin at first, then widening as they climbed, like reeds learning to become organs. Each column carried fragment of sound that resembled human voices, but not quite. Echoes of the people removed, intention stripped of grammar. They overlapped, merged, dissolved, reassembled, resolving into chords no instrument could hold without breaking. The valley became an ear, the ridge a throat. Thought cannot survive such abundance. Recognition can. Juno felt her mind step aside to make space for the wider remembering. She stood very still and let the sound do the thinking. Micah clutched his head, crying with no noise, his face arranged in the gratitude of someone finally hearing the answer to a question he hadn't been brave enough to ask. The light wasn't blinding anymore. It had clarified. Through it, she could see everything. The diner's patient chrome, the high water mark still faint on the cannery bricks, the way a certain maple leaned into the schoolyard wind each autumn as if to shield something small. Every moment the town had ever been silent rose and passed through the light. Kindness is too shy to say their names, apologies buried under thrift, grief filed alphabetically for lack of ceremony. The ridge had been listening all along, turning every unspoken thing into music. From somewhere above, the sky hummed an answer. The curtain at the horizon folded back along invisible seams, and now there were vast, faint shapes hidden in the clouds, symmetrical, immense, moving without wings, geometry traveling as if thought had grown bones. They weren't ships. Ships go places. These were places going through places, lattices of resonance passing like cathedrals built from intervals. They altered the air by existing in it. You could feel the changes they made to distance. The sound filled the valley, a single sustained tone, generous and exact, the kind that makes the knees forget their opinions. People reached for furniture without looking. Dogs lowered themselves to the floor as if invited to prey. The neon in the diner windows steadied, and then glowed the color of a warm truth. Inside someone's pocket, a watch stopped on the number that mattered. The tone did not ask for submission. It asked for availability. It made room, then layered over it. Came a whisper Juno knew the way you know which cupboard holds the cups in a dark kitchen. "Juno!" Her grandmother's voice, soft, lucid, filled with both apology and wonder. 100 small winters thawed in Juno's chest. She didn't look for the source. In a place like this, you look with the part of you that learned to listen before it learned to point. "We left the door open," the voice said. "It was never supposed to close." The sentence unlatched a dozen others. Juno remembered the sewing room with its gold threads mapping a town that refused to be fully awake or fully asleep. She remembered the circle beneath the map, the remainder under the remainder. She remembered how the pause had felt like being trusted. Above her, the shapes in the cloud bank began to fragment into streaks of light, dissolving into the air the way smoke dissolves into what it already is. As they went, each carried the afterimage of someone the town had lost, not portraits, not faces, but a particular way a presence bent a room. A mother humming with the door half open, a boy's jacket drying on a chair that has not changed its habit, the kind of silhouette that grief knows by touch. The afterimages didn't brand the air. They forgave it. The fog lifted entirely, revealing the sea, impossibly still, the horizon a fine line stitched with patience. Juno's tongue went numb with salt and meaning. She looked down. Her hands were trembling in the polite way of someone handed a baby that belongs to time. Micah's lips shaped numbers again, and then quit. He wiped his face as if to make more room for the eyes to do their work. The columns thinned. The sky's lattices drifted higher, pulling the great cord taut between sea and cloud. And just before the light vanished, the sky spoke once more, not with breath, not with thunder, but with the inevitability of a tide making good on its math. The voice did not arrive at her ear. It touched the mind directly, with neither volume nor volumes opposite. Every silence remembers its sound. The sentence landed everywhere at once. In the attic where a trunk had kept a wedding dress's last sweetness. In the hollow under the school stage where a child once waited out a storm, counting her heartbeat against the metal of a flashlight. In the creek between stair 3 and 4, in Juno's grandmother's house. In the rust inside the cannery's pipes. The pipe remembered its river. In a field where a tractor key still lay under an inch of forgetfulness. The sentence did not argue. It accounted. Then stillness. Not the punitive halt of a machine that has blown a fuse, but the generous stillness of a room in which everyone has understood at once. The golden glow dimmed. The hum folded itself along creases it had ironed long ago. The ridge closed its lines with no seam, as if untouched earth had simply decided to be honest about its interior life. But Juno knew better. The sound hadn't ended. It had gone inward, the way a vowel leaves the mouth and learns to live in the chest. The pattern did not disappear. It took up residence in the places it always owned. In breath, in pulse, in the preference of roots for certain stones. The townspeople stepped back into themselves with a care that honored what had just passed through them. Someone in the diner laughed once, astonished, then covered her mouth to save the laugh for later. At the harbor, a fisherman tied the neatest knot of his life without quite looking at it. A child on Baird Street told his dog to sit, and the dog sat in a way that said, "I am grateful to be told something simple." The gulls remembered to argue with one another, and the argument felt like a hymn that had dressed down for work. Micah sank onto the curb and let the curb hold him. "Does it want something?" he asked, not needy, merely practical. "It asked already," Juno said. She felt her voice return carefully, a guest taking off its shoes. "It asked us to listen back." "How?" The word let out a small, surprise fog. Juno looked at the world around them, newly legible. The ridge wore no crown. The snow was only itself again where it remained. The steam had agreed to water. "With what we leave unwritten," she said, with a pause. "With the count. In houses up and down needlepoint. Clocks that had disagreed for decades found a compromise within a second. The church bell did not ring. It had rung already by learning how to wait. The radar dish on Cemetery Hill faced neither sky nor sea but settled at a thoughtful angle toward the ridge, as if taking notes. People came outdoors without deciding to. They did not gather. They arrived in one another's lines of sight in the gentle geometry of towns. Hands found pockets, found other hands, found rails and posts. The body likes to anchor in the wake of revelation. No one spoke first because no one needed to. The pause belonged to them now. It had learned their names. The ocean breathed, not the brute breath of weather, but the home breath of a sleeper who has remembered a dream and decided not to flee it. A single wave traveled farther than it had intended, and then, with great sincerity, apologized by smoothing the sand it had disturbed. Juno felt the recorder in her pocket, cool and obedient. She did not take it out. Archive is a good servant and a poor parent. The words she wanted were not for tape. They were for distance and the people who would enter it. On the hill behind her, a deer stepped from the trees and stood in the place where light had lately learned to speak. It lowered its head and tasted the air as if reading the last sentences off a page and liking the ending. Then it walked a long way around the circle, refusing to cross it, as if honoring the memory of a boundary that had never been meant for hooves. The wind resumed its sideways work, but with a new courtesy to corners. The light at the diner window went back to behaving like neon. Somewhere, the mailman lifted his satchel with 2 hands instead of 1, surprising his shoulder with kindness. Near the school, a basketball thudded against asphalt and made a noise that seemed pleased to be the size it was. Juno stood until her knees argued, then sat with Micah on the curb. A light frost began to lace the grass where the steam had let go. She watched it forming complicated architectures and felt no need to interpret them. The ridge lay quiet, but quiet had ceased to be a verdict. It was a tool again, a room with chairs and daylight. What if we misunderstand it? Micah asked at last, voice steadying. What if we think we're answering and we're not? Well, no, Juno said. It will go loud again. He laughed, wiped his face with his sleeve, and left a bright path across skin, a map of mineral and relief. And if it doesn't, then we keep the door open, she said. And the sentence fit in her mouth like it had been waiting for the right roof to say it under. We keep counting. We leave space and sentences where mercy can sit. A long time later, minutes, or the kind of hour that villages know and calendars cannot, someone began to sweep a porch with a broom that had outlived a decade of winters. The bristles made the old rhythmic sound they had been hired for. Across town, a kettle put its shoulder into steam. The familiar resumed, but it had been rewired to carry more of itself. It would be easy to call it over, to pack the all-way, write unexplained in the ledger where light had tallied what needed tallying, and return to the business of days. Yet Juno felt in the new interior of her silence a continuing, not an aftershock, a resonance. The world had said a thing and had not unsaid it. It had folded the tone into ground, into glass, into the space between eye and tear. The sound had not ended. It had gone inward. She touched the pavement with her fingertips the way one touches the forehead of fever that's broken. The warmth there was ordinary now, but ordinariness is simply the miracle we survive long enough to name. She closed her eyes and listened for the place where her breath and the ridge's breath made the same small promise. Around them, people tried first sentences and then decided against them, smiling as if the silence were learning to be local. A boy on a bicycle rode past with his head turned toward the hill, paying the ancient price for wonder by swerving and correcting and laughing at his competence. Janine came out of the diner carrying 2 mugs, handed them off without inventory, and stood with her hands empty in the happiest way hands can be. Juno raised a mug and let the heat rest against her lip without drinking yet. The steam rose and wrote unreadable kindness in the air. She thought of her grandmother's sewing room, the map of threads, the circle that called itself a lung, and a remainder. She thought of the sentence the sky had given back. Every silence remembers its sound. She thought, we are surrounded by acquired disguise as weather. What now? Micah asked, not fearful, just doing the job of the mouth. Now we keep listening, she said. And when it comes time, we answer with a note only we can hold. Across the valley, the ridge lay as innocently as a shoulder under a blanket. But innocence, she understood, is what the world looks like after it had confessed and been believed. The line where sea met sky was clean and quiet and full of rehearsal. The world was waiting for someone to answer. It did not demand an anthem. It wanted a note, steady and human, held long enough for the rest of the chord to recognize its friend. She filled her lungs, felt the count, 4, 3, 2, 1, and let the pause come to sit with her a heartbeat longer than safety. Then, not aloud, not yet, she gave the answering pitch the size of her life and felt, with the uncomplicated gratitude of metal finding its magnet. The ridge answered back by staying beautifully, powerfully still. For 2 full days, Needlepoint forgot how to speak. Not because anyone had gone mute. Throats worked, tongues shaped words, mouths opened, but because there was nothing left to say that words could hold without breaking. Every sentence that tried to rise dissolved midway into vibration, a hum just shy of melody, as if language itself had grown tired of being misunderstood. The air trembled with the unspoken. Door hinges sang softly when moved. Spoons rang like tuning forks against mugs. Conversations began as whispers and ended as harmonies that no one claimed responsibility for. It was as though the town had become a single instrument rediscovering how to tune itself. Juno sat at the diner's counter, the same stool she'd occupied through half her life, through morning coffee, post-storms, funerals, and first snows. Now the counter gleamed faintly, every surface catching the strange, slow gold that lived in the town's new daylight. Before her, the tape recorder sat like a relic and a witness. The reel spun without power, endlessly rewinding and unwinding some invisible thread of memory. The faint dust that had settled across its buttons glittered with each breath she exhaled, as if the air had learned to measure time through her lungs. Micah sat beside her, sketching on the back of a napkin. His pencil moved with uncertain reverence, tracing the ridge as though it might vanish if he pressed too hard. His lines intersected like map coordinates, though none pointed north. "What do you think it was?" he asked finally, his voice quiet but not tentative. Less a question than a confession of curiosity. Juno didn't look up. She watched the reels instead, their rhythm syncing with the faint pulse she could feel beneath her own skin. "Not was," she said. "Still is." The words felt solid in her mouth, heavier than sound. Outside, the snow was gone. Every flake melted into air that now shimmered faintly with residual warmth. The sea was unnaturally calm, no chop, no current, just a smooth reflection of sky that refused to decide on a single color. The horizon glowed faintly blue-gold, and the gulls drifted lower than usual, gliding soundlessly over the glass-like water. No one in town was pretending anymore, pretending to fix the boats, the signs, the clocks, the engines. There was nothing left to fix, because nothing was breaking. Even time had slowed its fraying pace. It was as though the town itself had entered a long inhale, the moment before breath becomes choice. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, dense, generous, humming with the memory of what it had contained. That night, Juno walked back to her grandmother's house at the edge of the woods. The path, usually littered with pine needles, shimmered under her boots as if the earth had retained some of the sky's light. The house awaited her like a pulse she hadn't yet measured. Inside, the air was warmer than it should have been for winter. Dust motes floated in golden suspension, moving not randomly but rhythmically. Slow, deliberate, obedient to a beat too large for her ears to hear directly. She climbed the stairs to the sewing room. The golden threads were still there. They no longer hung loose from the walls or gathered in heaps. They were woven into floorboard themselves, running like veins through the wood. Each strand hummed softly, not continuously but in a slow wave, as if responding to something beneath the house. Juno knelt and touched one. The moment her finger brushed it, the light rippled outward like silk stirred by invisible wind. The hum deepened, not louder but closer, threading itself through her pulse until she could no longer tell which beat belonged to whom. Then the threads began to shift. They moved like a living thing stretching awake, reweaving themselves into a new configuration. Circles within circles, rotating in opposite directions, intersecting in the center like an eye remembering to open. Each rotation pulsed faintly, timed to a heartbeat, but not hers. The tone that rose from it was low, almost human, the sound of someone breathing behind a wall. Juno leaned closer. "What are you showing me?" she whispered. The air responded. Her grandmother's voice emerged, not from the tape recorder, not from the walls, but from the space itself. It vibrated through her bones with the familiarity of lullabies. "You're hearing the translation," the voice said, tender but unyielding. "It's not talking to you. It's talking through you." Juno's throat tightened. She swallowed, tried to steady her breath, but even that rhythm no longer belonged to her. Her pulse was sinking to something vast, deliberate, patient. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You don't have to," came the reply, like a breeze through the ribs of the bell. "Understanding ends things. Listening continues them." The threads brightened. The light filled the room like water filling a basin, climbing the walls, curling around furniture, turning the dust into constellations. It didn't hurt. It healed. The edges of objects softened, the boundaries between shadow and reflection dissolving. The room wasn't lit. It was remembered. Juno's hand trembled as she pressed it against the floor. The wood felt warm, and beneath it she could feel the faint rhythm of something deeper. The ridge itself, humming faintly through the earth. Outside, the ridge glowed again. The gold light spread down its slopes in quiet rivers, threading its way into the harbor, spilling across the water in lines that mirrored the pattern beneath her palms. One by one, the streetlights of Needle Point flickered, not in random intervals, but in measured pulses. On, pause, each light sinking to a single shared breath. The town was breathing. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps outside, crunching the frozen grass. The door opened with a startled gasp, and Micah stumbled in, his cheeks raw with cold, his breath visible in the golden air. "They're back," he said, eyes wide, voice half awe, half fear. But not in the sky this time. He held out his hand. In his palm, faintly luminous, was a pattern, a small golden spiral that pulsed once, twice, then settled into the rhythm of his heartbeat. The light didn't sit on his skin. It sank into it, glowing faintly from within, as though the air had written something inside him. Juno reached for his hand, but before her fingers touched his, something shifted in the reflection on the window behind him. Her reflection moved, not subtly, not with a small, uncanny errors of glass, but deliberately. It looked at her, not with imitation but awareness. The reflection's mouth opened slowly, its eyes filled with the same golden dust that now drifted through the air, and it whispered, "The answer is already inside the sound." The glass trembled. The entire window pane shimmered like liquid light, the reflection folding back into itself until it became nothing but a ripple in the air. Then the ridge began to hum again. The sound rolled through the floorboards, into the walls, through the pipes, through the blood in their veins. This time, it wasn't just a tone. It was breathing, slow, deliberate, alive. The rhythm matched not one heart, but many, the collected pulse of every living thing within the valley. Micah's eyes met hers. He didn't need to speak. Neither did she. The hum filled the space between them with everything that had ever needed to be said and everything that never could be. Outside, the harbor shimmered gold. The wind moved again, carrying with it a faint resonance, like the echo of a language being spoken backward into time. The sky pulsed faintly in answer, not with light this time, but with stillness. And somewhere beneath their feet, beneath the ridge, beneath the stitched map of lives that Needle Point had always been, something vast exhaled, slow, content, infinite. The hum deepened once, held steady, and began to form a shape in the air, a pulse, a pattern, a promise. And Juno, standing in her grandmother's glowing house, understood, not with thought, but with surrender, that the sound had never been about the beginning or the end. It was the middle, endlessly remembering itself. And for the first time, she breathed with it. By morning, the reflection stopped obeying, not in violent ways. No shattering, no jump-scare distortion, no hostile funhouse physics. Just small betrayals with the courtesy of a flinch. A coffee mug lifted half a second too late in the diner window, while the real mug had already met a mouth. A child's smile remained a heartbeat longer after his face turned away, hanging in the glass like a sweet ghost that hadn't gotten the cue. A street lamp in the pharmacy door kept burning after the bulb inside had gone dark, its glow lingering as if light were reluctant to leave the place it had learned. The town's mirrored world had always been a humble stenographer. Now it was an editor with opinions. When Juno passed a storefront, the pain didn't show her doing the ordinary choreography of walking. Her reflection stared past her shoulder at the ridge behind her, expression unreadable, posture patient. It wasn't defiance. It was attention pointed elsewhere. The glass had joined the rest of Needle Point in remembering how to look deeper than surface. The air grew heavy again, full of that fine-grained static before a thunderstorm that never quite arrives, the kind that lifts the small hairs along the forearms and draws a metallic line along the gum line. Juno tasted iron at the back of her tongue, and something else she could never describe without sounding like a child. The scent of lightning arrested mid-breath, a held spark, a discipline of fire. Breathing felt ceremonial. Inhale, consider, allow. Each step she took sent a faint shiver across thin puddles on the road, as if the water were translating her weight into a language more useful to the ground. On Main Street, doors opened onto pauses instead of rooms. People stood in those thresholds with objects in their hands that had lately remembered their tonality. A mechanic rolled a socket in his palm, and it purred. A teacher balanced a brass bell on her fingertips, and the metal trembled without sound, delighted simply to be considered for its true work. No one asked one another what was happening. They had used up their questions on bigger silences. The town had learned to nod with its whole body. Juno walked down to the harbor with the tape deck tucked against her ribs. She hadn't pressed play in days. She didn't need to. Reels and leaders were artifacts of a smaller mercy. Still, the deck's weight had become an honest comfort, like a stone that warms the hand. The handle squeaked in its old way. The machine smelled faintly of sun-cooked plastic and a summer long ago when music had been a location as well as a thing. The harbor's boards groaned in their usual places but lower, as if gravity had been tuned a note down. Micah was already there, standing on the edge of the dock with his palms open to the sea. His posture belonged to a priest who has had the luxury of renouncing certainty. The wind tugged at his jacket and then reconsidered, falling into the stillness with the rest of the morning. "The hum's under the water now," he said, not turning. "Not on the ground anymore. Does it feel different?" Juno asked. He hesitated, the way people hesitate before a compliment that might become a confession. "It feels closer." They stood that way for a while, hands empty and full. The tide wasn't moving. It held itself like breath held to steady a hand. Across the surface, faint concentric rings pulsed outward from invisible center, gold at the edges, paling as they narrowed, a breathing the sea had decided to do with its skin. Each ring reached the pilings, climbed them delicately with light, then returned to the larger body, as if lanes of meaning had been opened and then gently closed. Even the algae, usually rude with their urgency, hung in polite green curtains that swayed to a meter too slow for wind. Juno set the tape deck on the boards and pressed record. The reels did not turn. Instead, the machine vibrated, softly, finding the water's rhythm as a hand finds a pulse in a wrist. The hum sharpened, not loud, never loud, just precise, rising until it sounded almost like language, not English, not any tonal system humans had hired to do their daily lifting, but syntax. It had the sensation of clauses and mercy, and the kind of comma that can save a life. The question arrived without traveling. "Do you remember the first sound you made?" It didn't come from the water. It didn't assemble in the air and then apply for entrance through her ears. It formed in her chest like a breath that had chosen to be a sentence, and then echoed in her ribs and voices her bones recognized as older than her. She tried to answer and found her mouth negotiating with a gentler authority. Her lips moved. No word arrived. The silence after her attempt was long and expectant. The way a room holds space for a grieving person to decide what size they can be in public. On the harbor skin, the sky's reflection trembled but did not break, an unblinking eye that had learned courtesy. Fog began to move. Not in, up, threads of it unspooled from beneath the surface, lifting like pale seaweed becoming weather. Through those veils, figures came into view along the shore. Not specters, townspeople. Each held something metallic. Keys, spoons, watches, scissors, pliers, a tiny harmonica that had outlived 3 summers, a dog tag that had done its work too well. None of them brandished anything. They held their objects the way one holds a candle at a vigil, upright, soft-handed, available. As the fog thinned, the metal sang the single note it had always saved for emergencies. No one had tuned them. The hum had simply chosen its instruments. Juno recognized Janine among them, diner apron still tied, the fabric taking on that faint inward glow the gold gave anything honest. Janine's hair had escaped its clip. Her eyes had learned a new kind of patience. She smiled, the good kind that knows exactly where it hurts and respects the ache. "It's asking for balance," Janine said, not loudly, and yet the sentence reached everything that needed it. "It's been keeping score too long. What happens if we answer?" Juno asked. Janine looked toward the ridge, which was not performing. It lay like any other hill, except for how every stone knew its name. "Then maybe it can rest," she said. "Or maybe we finally can." Micah's radio, never obedient, always earnest, began to buzz as if he had chosen it for a hive. The sound rose slow as a tide and then sharp enough to draw tears. A handful of people flinched. Nobody fled. Juno felt the sound in the nerves of her teeth and in the tender places where her fingers remembered learning to sew. The pitch climbed until it became impossible, and then, like mercy, it stopped climbing. It held. The world made room. The reflections decided together. They left. Every pane of glass and needlepoint went to mat, like eyes that had agreed to rest at the same instant. The harbor's surface, which had been glass for too long, turned black. Not color, not absence, but the honest black of depth, of privacy, of a door closing because a room is being prepared. On the ridge, the gold lines blinked once, eyelids closing upon light instead of opening toward it, and then they lay as quiet as an oath that has remembered it does not need to be repeated to be binding. Juno found her voice and didn't recognize it, which is how a voice should sound after it has listened for long enough. What did it take? She asked the air or Janine or the learned stillness that had begun making the decisions language once applied for. Janine didn't move. She kept her keys lifted as if the metal were mid-prayer. "Nothing," she said. "Just the things we never meant to keep." The sentence loosened a knot at the base of Juno's skull. She felt it travel through her shoulders, into her chest, down her arms. Just the things we never meant to keep. The grudges polished into heirlooms, the apologies postponed until they soured, the names we kept in our mouths like coins we couldn't afford to spend, the breath we refused because what if needing is a debt. Ledger lines rearranged themselves somewhere she could not see. Columns that had tallied loss made room for a new arithmetic. Keeping mercies, unkeeping grief. The hum stopped, not because it was over, but because its work had changed verbs. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It had texture and temperature, and a weight you could share without being crushed. It was saturated with meaning the way a shirt is saturated with sun after hanging all morning. Not wet, not dry, but convinced. In that silence, clocks remembered the dignity of not being consulted for every choice. A dog with head on a knee and agreed not to be brave for a while. In a drawer somewhere, a letter that had been read too many times decided to be folded one last time with gentleness instead of urgency. Juno looked down into the harbor. The surface had become a page that refused ink, but it told the truth. She didn't see her face. Relief came with that. Her face had done enough. She saw the sky, wide open, remembering how to close, not as retreat, but as punctuation, closing as a generosity of a period instead of the threat of a wall, a lid that promises to be lifted again by a hand that now knows when. Behind her, footsteps approached without announcing themselves and stopped at what felt like the precise distance at which one human can be wholly present to another without asking the air to choose. Micah set the radio on the dock. It lay there like a heart that had learned to keep its own company. He sat, feet dangling over the water that had decided not to mirror anyone for a while. "I keep thinking about the first sound I made," he said, eyes on the black surface that wasn't waiting. It was sustaining. What if it wasn't crying? What if it was listening? "Maybe that's what crying is," Juno said, the first practice breath of listening. It wasn't clever. It didn't need to be. The sentence made a space and then left it available. All along the shore, the townspeople lowered their metal to their sides. The keys and rings and spoons had done their small work. No one clapped. What applause could the sea require? Janine walked to the edge of the pier and let her keys hang over the water without dropping them. The chain made a gentle, disciplined line. The gold in the fog had dimmed to the color of bread crusts and good wood. It was a hue you could call ordinary and be right and be grateful. From deep under the harbor, something shifted. Not the old hum, not the machine of it, but a change in posture. The kind of motion you make in a chair when you've been sitting too long, and the conversation turns toward the part that needs witnesses and not judges. The water accepted the motion without telling everyone about it. Juno rested her palms on the deck and felt the faintest tremor move through the boards, into her wrists, up her arms, to the hinge at her jaw where so much of her unsaid had set up a bunk. The tremor didn't ask to be named. It asked to be joined. She closed her eyes, took an air to the count she knew without counting, and held it long enough that the pause could have a chance to speak. Across town, reflections rediscovered good manners. Mirrors returned to the humble hospitality of returning faces to owners. Windows again showed the differences between inside and out without taking sides. But none of the glass had forgotten. Obedience and amnesia are not the same. Every pain kept, like a watermark, the memory of having looked past a person and loved the hill that had held them. The tape deck on the dock exhaled a small, almost comical click, the old relay inside doing what had been taught, and then stilled. Juno put a fingertip on the record button and did not press. Archive was no longer the only way to be believed. She thought of her grandmother's sewing room, of the threads that had drawn circles within circles, and of the sentence that had arrived to the window a night ago. The answer's already inside the sound. What if we never answer? Micah asked after a time that had no quarrel with clocks. What if we only keep listening? Then we're answering. Juno said, we just won't get credit for it. He laughed. The soft kind that doesn't make the morning step aside. Maybe that's balance, too. Janine joined them on the dock without asking if there was room. There's always room for someone who knows how to stand in the silence without redecorating it. She placed her keys on the planks beside the radio and sat down, apron wrinkling into the posture of usefulness. I woke up with someone else's memory, she said. It was me in it, but the edges were bigger. Felt like the ridge was letting me borrow its point of view. She nodded toward the harbor. Then I realized I need to keep it. Nothing, Juno said, repeating the word slowly so it could land in the right chair. Just the things we never meant to keep. Past the breakwater, a single swell shouldered itself toward shore, considered the ethics of progress, and politely changed its mind. The sky overhead tried on the blue it had worn before all this, decided against it, and chose a color with more forgiveness in it. A lone cloud practiced closing and opening like a hand, practicing the blessing it intends to give. Somewhere up the hill in a house with family photographs that had stopped insisting on the past tense, a metronome clicked once from a drawer and scared nobody. At the school, a custodian stopped sweeping in mid-stroke, held the broom upright like a standard, and breathed once to the auditorium where the children would sing again when they dared. The radar on Cemetery Hill settled its dish, not at the sea, not the sky, but between where listening is widest. When Juno finally stood, the harbor's black surface accepted the shape of her absence without needing to advertise the fact. She lifted the tape deck and felt, in its old plastic, a gratitude that might have been hers. On the walk back up Main, she looked into a window and saw her reflection keep pace properly. It winked anyway, an indulgence. Behind it, the ridge wore a face only she could see. Not human, not even animal, but the expression a landscape makes when a vow is kept. At her grandmother's gate, she paused. The lilacs were already imagining June. In the upstairs window, the sewing room held its light the way a throat holds a held note, without strain, with promise. Juno thought of the gold spiral that had pulsed once in Micah's palm and then learned to belong to him. She thought of concentric rings on the harbor, of the town's small medals lifted like offerings and then put back into pockets as if dignity had been returned to tools. Wind moved. Not much. Enough to remind the world it could touch itself. She went inside, set the recorder on the table, and opened the window. The room took a breath. The curtains bowed a little, acknowledging the right, without making a sermon of it. The glass didn't delay her hand or invent a history. It showed her fingers and let them go. Night would come later with fewer arguments about how. The ridge would lie under it like a thought saved for the last page. People would sleep with their mouths a little open, the way infants do when they trust the air. A few would wake in the dark with the certainty that someone had whispered their name, and they would not be afraid because the certainty itself would be enough. For now, the stillness had a job and did it. The golden dimness in the corners was not magic. It was the humane light of a place that had decided to keep its interior uninjured. Juno closed her eyes and let the phrase the sky had given settle back where it belonged, beneath speech, beneath even listening. Every silence remembers its sound. And when she lifted her lids again, the day had not moved on. It had widened, The harbor remained black in the right way. The ridge kept its eye politely closed. Above it all, the sky waited with the calm of someone who has made peace with doors, how to leave them open, how to close them, how to trust that either gesture can be an answer when performed without fear. That night, Needlepoint's lights dimmed one by one, not an outage, but intention. There was no flicker, no warning hum of failing power. The bulbs simply understood their irrelevance and withdrew. One street lamp after another faded, not to darkness, but to a shade of honesty. Porch lights went first, as if tired of guarding doors that no longer needed guarding. The fluorescent hum of the diner softened, folded into the quiet like an old voice deciding not to finish its story. Even the ridge, once the town's heartbeat in gold, no longer glowed. Yet its absence carried presence, the kind that can't be seen but can't be ignored. The air above it shimmered faintly, a ghost spectrum beyond the visible, where color went to rest after finishing its shift. Juno woke sometime before dawn. She didn't know why until she heard it. Her heartbeat amplified. It came from the tape deck on her nightstand, though the machine wasn't on. The reels were still, but each pulse of her heart vibrated faintly through the metal casing, repeating, layered, multiplied. The sound was low, like breath caught inside a cavern. Beneath it, another rhythm answered, slower, deeper, older. The two beats met and merged, one folding into the other until her body could no longer tell which pulse belonged to which. She sat up, listening. The air in the room was thick, not with heat, but with vibration, an invisible hum that moved through the floor, through her chest, through everything built on this soil. The lamp beside her bed dimmed to match her breathing, as if light itself had joined the rhythm. When she stepped outside, the night was not silent. It was symphonic. The entire town was breathing in unison. Windows expanded slightly with each collective inhale, panes fogging for an instant before clearing again. Curtains rippled though the air was still. The trees along Main Street swayed without wind, bending with the rise and fall of an invisible tide. Even the ocean, far off and eternal, rose and sank at the same measured tempo, as though something beneath it had taken command of its lungs. Juno felt dizzy, not from fear, but from recognition. The world was in sync, and she was part of it. Every inhale pressed against her ribs. Every exhale carried a faint taste of salt and memory. She followed the pull of that pulse toward the ridge. The streets were deserted, though she sensed company everywhere. Shapes behind curtains, silhouettes leaning in doorways. Faces turned skyward in reverent confusion. The air thickened with each step, vibrating like a string drawn too tight. When she reached the ridge, she found Micah already there, standing ankle-deep in the golden soil that pulsed faintly beneath him. His breath misted in rhythm with the ground. His face glowed in a half-light that wasn't quite light at all. "It's alive," he whispered. His voice carried the awe of someone discovering prayer. Not in the way we mean it, but alive. Juno stared at the earth beneath his feet. The gold veins moved slowly, expanding and contracting like veins under skin. What's it waiting for? Micah's eyes shone with tears. For us to stop waiting. They stood together in silence, and the ridge answered. Lines of light ran outward from beneath them, traveling across the valley like a heartbeat too large for one body. Each pulse corresponded to someone in town. Juno could feel it. She closed her eyes and knew where each thread went. Janine, kneeling in the diner, fingers clasped around her apron. The old mechanic on his porch, laughing softly because he'd seen this kind of miracle once in a dream. A child turning in sleep, lips shaping a question he hadn't yet learned to ask. The hum wove them all together. The air shimmered, not with heat, but with awareness. For one impossible moment, every person in Needlepoint, awake, asleep, or dreaming, felt the same thing, seen, not looked at, but understood, the kind of recognition that strips language down to breath. Then the sound began to rise. Not louder, deeper. It sank through wood and glass, through lungs and memory, until it vibrated behind the eyes of everyone who had ever called this place home. Paintings rattled softly in their frames. The harbor rippled without wind. Even the stars seemed to pulse, their cold light dimming and brightening, as if nodding along. Juno gasped. Her body had stopped hearing. It was translating. The hum changed, arranging itself into patterns. Tones becoming syllables, syllables stretching into words. They weren't English, not exactly, but her mind found a meaning anyway, carried through her bones like ancestral memory. We are the remainder of what your silence built. Juno froze. The words weren't spoken aloud. They were printed into her chest. We were never above you. She fell to her knees, not in fear, but in the unbearable intimacy of being addressed. Her pulse synchronized the ridge. Her heartbeat a single instrument in a vast orchestra. You remembered us, the voice continued. So we became. The ridge flared with light, veins branching outward like roots seeking water. Golden lines reached across the valley, tracing pathways that connected every home, every heart, every secret left unsaid. The light moved toward the sea, spreading in thin threads that kissed the waves and lingered there. Then the ocean answered. Its surface broke into patterns, ripples that formed spirals, spirals that became symbols, symbols that pulsed faintly with the same golden hue. Each tide shimmered, then stilled, as if acknowledging a truth too large for motion. Micah gripped her shoulder, trembling. It's merging, he said. With what? He looked at her, eyes wide with something between terror and revelation. With us. The hum intensified, not threatening, but encompassing. The ground beneath them moved like a heartbeat magnified through stone. The pulse joined everything that had ever made sound in needlepoint. The rustle of leaves, the roll of waves, the sigh of wind through power lines, the footsteps of the living, the echoes of the dead. It all aligned. One long exhale. Juno's vision blurred. The world seemed to stretch outward and inward at once, her body both infinitesimal and infinite. The hum passed through her, carrying fragments of thought not her own, lullabies hummed in dark rooms, confessions left half-written, laughter caught in the back of her throat. Everything that had ever been unsaid was being spoken now, in tone, in rhythm, in light. And then, with unbearable gentleness, the ridge whispered, every grain of gold trembling, as if clearing its throat after centuries of silence. We only wanted to be heard once. The words fell like snow that melted before touching the ground, absorbed instantly into everything. The hum stopped. The valley fell still. The stillness didn't feel like absence. It felt like completion, the final breath of song that no longer needed to be sung. Juno stayed on her knees, the soil beneath her warm, pulsing faintly against her palms. Around her, needlepoint held its breath, not fearful but fulfilled. The air had grown transparent again. The stars returned, smaller but closer somehow. Then came the heartbeat, soft, steady, human. It wasn't hers alone. It wasn't the ridge's. It was both indistinguishable. Each beat echoed faintly through the valley, through plank, stone, water, skin. The rhythm of life, merged with the rhythm of what had been waiting beneath it all along. Micah reached for her hand. Do you feel it? She nodded. It's still there. It always will be, she said. The ridge glowed faintly once more, not gold this time but colorless. Light so pure contained every hue and none at all. It pulsed once, twice, like a final heartbeat, and then subsided into quiet. The stars above needlepoint blinked in answer, aligning just enough to resemble a pulse tracing across the heavens. Juno closed her eyes and let the rhythm carry her, the earth's breath moving through her chest, her pulse echoing in the soil. She understood now. The world wasn't waiting for sound. It was waiting for witness. And in that endless exchange between breath and silence, life and its echo, she whispered, not to the ridge, not to the sea, but to the space that had learned how to listen. We heard you. The night received the words gently, folded them into itself, and replied in kind with a single, patient beat.